There is something strangely comforting about the idea that a person might not completely disappear when their life ends, especially in a world like Ooh, where death has never been quite as simple as it seems. People die, kingdoms collapse, memories fade, and entire civilizations can disappear beneath forests or oceans. But Adventure Time keeps leaving behind little suggestions that some things continue anyway. At first, Finn seems like the simplest example of a hero who has grown up inside this strange world. He is a human boy who happens to live in a land filled with magic, and his story appears to begin when he is found as a baby and eventually grows up alongside Jake. But the deeper mythology of the series quietly tells us that Finn's story began much earlier than that. There was another life before him, another person who walked through Oo's history, made her own mistakes, loved different people, and eventually died without ever knowing that centuries later, another version of the same deeper identity would be running through the forests with a sword in his hand. Her name was Shoko, and once you understand what she represents, Finn's entire life starts to look less like the beginning of a story and more like one moment in something that has been happening for a very long time. Shoko's appearance in the series is easy to underestimate because Adventure Time does not introduce her with the kind of explanation that would immediately tell us how important she is. She appears in a story that initially seems to be about Princess Bubblegum's history, the strange ruins around the Candy Kingdom, and a young thief trying to survive in a dangerous world. Shoko is not introduced as Finn's predecessor. She does not walk onto the screen announcing that she is connected to him, and she certainly does not behave like someone carrying the memories of a future life. She is simply a girl living in a much older version of Ooh, and that is precisely what makes the revelation work. She has her own personality, her own circumstances, and her own reasons for making the decisions she makes. She is not Finn wearing another face. She is Shoko, and yet the show eventually reveals that she is also part of Finn's reincarnation cycle. That distinction is important because it tells us what Adventure Time actually means by reincarnation. If Shoko were simply Finn with all of Finn's memories transferred into another body, the idea would be relatively straightforward. We could say that Finn had existed before, forgot everything, and eventually returned. But that is not what happens. Shoko does not know she will become Finn. Finn does not remember being Shoko. Their lives are separated by an enormous amount of time, and almost every detail that would normally connect one person to another has disappeared. Their bodies are different, their experiences are different, their relationships are different, and even their personalities are shaped by the worlds they grow up in. What remains is something much harder to define. The series suggests that beneath the changing personalities and circumstances, there is a deeper identity capable of returning, but that identity does not erase the individuality of each incarnation. This makes Shoko's story surprisingly important to understanding Finn's character. Finn spends most of his childhood believing that his identity is something he creates through his choices. He wants to be a hero because he enjoys helping people, because adventure excites him, and because he has built a particular idea of what a good person should be. He does not need a prophecy telling him that he is important. He simply acts. Even when he makes mistakes, his mistakes belong to him. This becomes more meaningful once we realize that Finn is connected to lives he never remembers. If some deeper part of him existed before, then his personality is not simply inherited from the past. He still has to become Finn himself. That is one of the quiet differences between reincarnation and ordinary inheritance. If Finn inherited a sword from someone, he could use the sword or reject it. If he inherited a kingdom, he could choose whether to rule it. But with reincarnation, the inheritance is invisible. He carries something he cannot see and cannot consciously access. He does not know what Shoko experienced, and he cannot simply open a book containing all her memories. Whatever has survived between them has survived without explanation, almost like a pattern that continues underneath the surface. This means Finn is not burdened with the memories of previous lives, but neither is he completely disconnected from them. The strange part is that the show gives us enough evidence to believe that this connection matters without ever making it the only explanation for Finn's personality. Shoko is adventurous and stubborn. Finn is adventurous and stubborn. Both are capable of making impulsive decisions. Both are drawn to danger, and both seem to have a deep instinct to keep moving forward even when their circumstances would give them every reason to stop. But these similarities do not mean that Finn is secretly repeating Shoko's life. He is not destined to make the same mistakes she made. Instead, the similarities suggest that something fundamental about the person beneath the individual lives may continue to express itself in different ways. This becomes particularly interesting when we look at the world Shoko inhabits. She lives in a version of Wu that Finn would recognize only through ruins and old stories. The Candy Kingdom exists in an earlier form. Princess Bubblegum is still young enough for Shoko to interact with her directly, and the landscape itself has not yet developed into the familiar world Finn knows. For Shoko, none of this is ancient history. It is simply the present. She is not walking through a museum. She is living her life. The ruins that Finn might eventually explore as evidence of the past are still active places in Shoko's world, filled with people who have no idea that their civilization will eventually become something future generations barely understand. That is one of the most effective things Adventure Time does with its timeline. It refuses to treat history as something that only belongs to the past. Every era was once someone's present. The people who built the things Finn discovers weren't thinking about becoming ancient history. They were trying to survive their own problems, fall in love, protect their homes, and get through ordinary days. Shoko's story makes that idea personal because Finn eventually becomes connected to one of those forgotten people. The distant past is no longer just a collection of facts about Wu. It is part of the story of the person we have been following all along. And once you know that, even Finn's fascination with old ruins feels slightly different. He spends his life exploring places without realizing how deeply connected he is to the history buried inside them. He is constantly discovering civilizations that came before him, while unknowingly carrying his own history from those civilizations. It's almost as if Wu keeps revealing pieces of itself to Finn, while withholding the most personal piece from him, the fact that he has already lived before. And this also explains why the reincarnation reveal does not need Finn to remember Shoko. If the purpose were simply to give Finn another set of adventures, then giving him access to his previous memories would make sense. But Adventure Time is interested in something more philosophical. It wants to ask whether a person can remain meaningful without being remembered. Shoko's life matters, even though Finn does not remember living it. Her experiences still happened. Her choices still mattered. Her relationships still existed. Her death did not become meaningless simply because the next incarnation could not recall her. That idea becomes particularly important in a series where memory is constantly treated as something fragile. Simon loses his memories and identity through the crown. Marceline carries memories that almost nobody else can share. Princess Bubblegum remembers civilizations and relationships that have disappeared. Finn eventually encounters people and places that preserve fragments of the past without preserving the full story. In Adventure Time, forgetting does not necessarily mean something never happened. Sometimes forgetting is simply what happens when enough time passes. Finn's previous life therefore creates a strange relationship between memory and identity. We normally think that remembering our past is what makes us who we are. But Shoko suggests that Adventure Time does not completely agree. There can be continuity without conscious memory. There can be identity without an uninterrupted biography. Something can continue even when the person carrying it has no idea that it is there. This is also why Finn should not be thought of as simply Shoko reborn. That description is technically useful, but emotionally incomplete. Shoko deserves to remain Shoko. Her life should not be reduced to being a setup for Finn's. The fact that she becomes part of his reincarnation cycle does not erase her individuality. If anything, the story becomes more meaningful because her life is allowed to matter independently. She lived, she suffered, she made choices, and she died. Finn is connected to her, but he does not replace her. That becomes the first major clue that reincarnation in Adventure Time is not about preserving the past perfectly. It is about allowing something to continue while still allowing the new life to become something different. And this idea becomes even more interesting when we look beyond Shoko, because the series eventually reveals that Finn's reincarnation is not simply an isolated supernatural event. There is a larger cosmic system surrounding him, and the Catalyst Comet is one of the most important pieces of it. The comet has appeared across enormous periods of history, and its connection to Finn places his reincarnation inside a cycle that existed long before the events we normally associate with his life. The Catalyst Comet changes the scale of the story. Before learning about it, we can think of Shoko and Finn as two people connected by an unusual form of reincarnation. After learning about the comet, it becomes harder to see that connection as a coincidence. Finn's existence is part of something much larger than his own lifetime. The same cosmic cycle that brings the comet into Oo's history is connected to the appearance of certain extraordinary beings, including the Lich, and it places Finn within a pattern that seems to operate independently of the kingdoms and civilizations around him. This is where Finn's story becomes much more complicated than the familiar idea of destiny. Adventure Time does not simply say that Finn is destined to become a hero because some cosmic force selected him. Finn still makes his own choices. He has to learn how to deal with heartbreak. He has to learn that being a hero does not mean always getting what he wants. He has to confront the consequences of his mistakes. His previous lives do not make those experiences unnecessary. They simply suggest that Finn is part of a pattern that is much older than he realizes. And perhaps that is why the idea of past lives fits Finn so well. He is a character obsessed with movement. He wants to travel, explore, discover, fight, and understand. He is always moving to the next thing. His life literally follows the same principle. Even death does not completely stop the journey. The person changes, the world changes, and the relationships change, but something continues moving forward. There's also a quieter sadness hidden inside that idea. If Finn's soul continues through different lives, then the people he loves in one life do not necessarily travel with him. Shoko's relationships do not become Finn's relationships. The people who knew Shoko never get to meet Finn as the same person they loved. If Finn eventually dies and is reincarnated again, his future relationships may disappear in exactly the same way. From the perspective of the cosmic cycle, something continues. From the perspective of the individual, something has been lost. This makes Finn's relationships in his current life more meaningful rather than less. Jake matters because Finn only has this particular life with Jake. Princess Bubblegum matters because Finn experiences that relationship as Finn. Marceline matters because she knows him as the person he is now. The fact that some deeper part of him may continue does not make these relationships replaceable. In fact, it makes their temporary nature more important. Adventure Time constantly plays with this tension between permanence and impermanence. Some things last for thousands of years, while others exist for only a few moments. Finn's soul may continue, but his childhood cannot. The Candy Kingdom may survive for centuries, but individual friendships still change. The elemental forces may return, but each person who carries them eventually develops a life that belongs uniquely to them. Finn's past lives are therefore not really a story about escaping death. They are a story about what death cannot completely erase. And that question leads naturally into the next layer of Oo's mythology, because Finn is not the only thing that seems to return. The ancient world contains forces that survive through completely different people, and unlike Finn, these forces are not necessarily tied to one individual soul. They seem to belong to the world itself. Ice appears again. Fire appears again. Candy appears again. Other elemental forces continue through different eras, long after the people who originally carried them have disappeared. This is where the story of Evergreen becomes important. Evergreen lived thousands of years before Finn, at a time when Ooh was almost unrecognizable. He was not part of Finn's modern world, and he never knew anything about the Candy Kingdom as Finn would eventually know it. Yet one of the most important objects in Finn's world can be traced directly back to him. The ice crown that eventually destroys Simon's identity was created during Evergreen's attempt to protect the world from the Catalyst Comet. That means Finn's connection to the ancient past is not only spiritual. The physical world around him is carrying the consequences of that past, too. And this is where the story quietly changes, because if Finn represents a person returning through history, Evergreen represents something different, a force surviving through history, with its consequences passing from one civilization to another, even when nobody remembers where they came from. The ice crown survives. Evergreen disappears. Simon eventually finds it. And thousands of years after its creation, the decision of one ancient elemental becomes one of the defining tragedies of the modern world. That is not reincarnation in the same sense as Finn's story, but the similarity is impossible to ignore. In both cases, the past refuses to stay where it belongs. Something crosses the boundary between eras. Something from an older world enters a newer one, and the people living in the newer world have to deal with the consequences they did not create. Finn carries a history inside him. Simon carries one on his head, and neither of them initially understand where that history came from. Once we begin looking at Ooh this way, the ancient elementals stop feeling like disconnected pieces of background lore. They become another part of the same enormous pattern, one in which the world keeps changing while certain identities, powers, and consequences continue moving beneath it. And Evergreen is where we first get to see that pattern in its oldest form. If Shoko's story only told us that Finn had lived before, it would already be one of the strangest pieces of Adventure Time lore. But the series does something much more interesting than giving Finn a single previous identity. It quietly places him inside a cycle that existed long before either Finn or Shoko were born. And the more we learn about that cycle, the harder it becomes to think of Finn's reincarnation as an isolated supernatural event. The Catalyst Comet suggests that there is a pattern moving through the universe on a scale so enormous that individual lives are almost impossible to see from a distance. Every so often, the comet appears, and with it comes the possibility of something new entering the world. Finn is connected to that pattern, but so are other beings whose purposes could not be more different from his. This is what makes the mythology so strange. The same cosmic system that can produce a hero can also produce something like the Lich, and neither of them needs to understand the system that brought them into existence. The first important thing to understand is that the comet is not simply an unusually powerful object flying through space. Its role in Adventure Time is much closer to that of a recurring cosmic event, something that appears at enormous intervals and seems to correspond with major changes in existence. The comet has appeared in different forms throughout history, and its influence is connected to individuals who eventually become incredibly important to the story. This gives Finn's reincarnation a much larger context. He is not simply a soul that happens to be capable of returning. He is part of a recurring pattern in which certain identities or forces emerge again and again as the universe continues moving forward. That pattern is particularly important because Finn himself never asked to be part of it. He grows up without knowing that he has lived before. He does not walk around Ooh believing that he has a cosmic destiny waiting for him. He simply thinks of himself as Finn, a human boy trying to become a hero. This makes his eventual connection to the larger cycle much more interesting because the mythology does not replace his personal story. Instead, it exists underneath it. Finn can spend an entire day worrying about a relationship, helping someone in trouble, or getting himself into an unnecessary fight while completely unaware that his existence is connected to events that began before the civilization around him was even recognizable. This is one of the reasons Adventure Time's approach to destiny feels different from the usual fantasy story. In many stories, discovering that character has a special destiny means discovering that their choices were always leading toward a predetermined conclusion. Finn's situation is much less convenient. Knowing that something has happened before does not tell him what will happen next. His previous lives do not give him a complete instruction manual. They do not make him wiser than everyone around him. They do not prevent him from making mistakes. If anything, the lack of memory makes his current life more important because he has to build it without relying on the experiences of the people he used to be. This becomes clear when we look at Shoko again. Shoko's life is not a failed version of Finn's life. It is not simply the first draft of the person Finn eventually becomes. She has her own motivations, and some of her decisions lead to consequences that Finn would never choose for himself. The fact that something of her continues into Finn does not mean that Finn is destined to repeat everything she did. The reincarnation cycle preserves continuity without demanding repetition. That distinction becomes crucial when we consider the catalyst comet. If the comet represents a recurring cosmic mechanism, then its purpose cannot simply be to produce identical individuals over and over again. The universe is not creating copies. It is producing new expressions of something that already existed. Finn can be connected to previous lives while still being entirely himself, just as a new generation of elementals can inherit an ancient force while developing a completely different personality. And this is where the Lich enters the picture. The Lich is one of the most disturbing figures in Adventure Time precisely because his existence is tied to the same cosmic mythology. His relationship with the Catalyst Comet means that he is not merely an ancient evil who happened to survive from an earlier period of Oo's history. He belongs to something much larger. The comet is associated with beings who can dramatically influence the course of existence, and the Lich appears as one of its most destructive manifestations. This creates an unsettling contrast. Finn represents the continuation of life. The Lich represents the desire for life to stop. Yet both are connected to the same cosmic system. That does not necessarily mean the universe is choosing between good and evil. Adventure Time rarely presents the cosmos as a moral machine that exists to reward heroes and punish villains. The Catalyst Comet seems more neutral and more mysterious than that. It brings change. What emerges from that change can be beautiful, destructive, or somewhere in between. The universe itself does not appear to care whether the result is Finn or the Lich. It simply continues. That idea is important because it prevents us from interpreting Finn's reincarnation as proof that the universe is inherently designed to protect him. Finn survives because he is part of a cycle, but being part of a cycle does not make him invincible. He can still die, he can still lose people, he can still fail. The existence of reincarnation does not eliminate the importance of individual death, because each incarnation remains temporary. In fact, the temporary nature of Finn's individual lives may be the entire point. Imagine knowing that some part of you will eventually return, but you have no idea when, where, or as whom. Would that make your current life feel less important or more important? Adventure Time never gives Finn the opportunity to sit down and answer that question directly, but the series repeatedly shows him behaving as though this life matters enormously. He cares about the people around him. He becomes attached to places. He suffers when relationships end. He experiences grief. If he subconsciously carries something from previous lives, it does not make him emotionally detached from the present. That is what makes his reincarnation different from immortality. Immortality would allow Finn to remain himself indefinitely. Reincarnation does not. Finn's current personality, memories, friendships, and experiences are temporary. Whatever continues afterward will not necessarily preserve the things that make this particular Finn recognizable. The cosmic cycle may continue, but Finn as we know him exists only once. That makes his relationship with Jake especially significant. Jake is not simply a companion who happens to be present during one incarnation. He is part of Finn's particular life, and that means their friendship cannot be assumed to continue automatically after death. Even if Finn returns, Jake's relationship with that future incarnation would not necessarily be the same. The emotional importance of their friendship comes from the fact that it belongs to these two people, in this specific period, inside this specific world. Adventure Time repeatedly asks us to care about temporary things while reminding us that the universe is enormous and constantly changing. Finn's reincarnation is one of the clearest examples. His soul may have a history that stretches far beyond the beginning of the series, but his individual life still has an ending.
This is also why the idea of past lives should not make Finn seem less human. It does almost the opposite. He is extraordinary in a cosmic sense, but his actual experience remains remarkably ordinary. He does not remember being Shoko. He does not understand the full purpose of the Catalyst Comet. He cannot simply access some ancient wisdom whenever he needs it. He has to learn through experience, like everyone else. And there is another detail that makes the cycle even more fascinating. Finn is not necessarily the only person whose existence can be understood through recurring cosmic patterns. The series is filled with characters who seem to occupy roles that existed before them. The elementals return, certain powers return, certain conflicts return. Even the structure of U itself seems to repeat patterns of destruction and rebuilding. Finn's reincarnation, therefore, fits into a much broader tendency in the series. Adventure Time is a world where history does not move in a perfectly straight line. It circles. It echoes. It produces familiar patterns in unfamiliar forms. But the important thing is that these repetitions are never exact. That is why comparing Finn to Shoko is so useful. If the cycle were perfectly circular, Finn would simply recreate Shoko's story. Instead, the cycle seems more like a spiral. Certain traits return, certain forces return, and certain relationships may have echoes across time. But the world has changed by the time the pattern comes around again. Finn is therefore living in a different U, surrounded by different people, with different problems and different opportunities. His life is connected to Shoko's without being trapped by it. The Catalyst Comet makes this even larger because it suggests that these cycles are not confined to one planet or one civilization. The comet comes from beyond U, and its appearance reminds us that the world Finn knows is only one small part of a much larger universe. The Mushroom War feels enormous when we first learn about it because it transformed the planet. But from the perspective of the cosmic cycle, even the Mushroom War is only one event inside a much longer history. That shift in scale is one of Adventure Time's favorite tricks. A character discovers a ruined building and thinks it is ancient. Then we learn it was built after the Mushroom War. Then we discover the Mushroom War happened thousands of years after Evergreen. Then we discover Evergreen himself lived inside a world shaped by cosmic forces that existed before his civilization. And then we realize that even those forces may not represent the beginning. Finn's past lives operate in exactly the same way. At first, Shoko seems like the beginning of the mystery. Then the Catalyst Comet shows us that Shoko is only one point inside a much larger cycle. This also helps explain why Finn's connection to the comet feels different from an ordinary prophecy. A prophecy usually points toward one future event. The comet points to recurrence. It is not telling Finn what he must become. It is revealing that the universe has produced similar extraordinary beings before and will continue doing so. That is a much stranger idea. It means Finn may be important without being unique. He matters deeply to the people around him, but from the perspective of cosmic history, there may be countless other lives occupying similarly important positions. His story is meaningful because it is his story, not because the universe has declared him the only person who matters. This becomes especially important when we eventually reach the elementals.
Their mythology provides another example of continuity without identity. Evergreen is not Princess Bubblegum. The ancient flame elemental is not Flame Princess. Patient Saint Pym is not simply another version of someone else. Yet the flame elemental forces continue appearing through different people. Their stories are connected because something persists beneath them, but their individual personalities remain distinct. Finn's reincarnation works in a surprisingly similar way. The soul continues. The person changes. And this is where Adventure Time becomes much more philosophical than its bright colors initially suggest. It is asking whether continuity requires sameness. If you are not carrying the same body, memories, relationships, or experiences, in what sense are you still the same person? The series never gives us a scientific definition of a soul, and it doesn't need to. Instead, it uses Finn's story to let the question remain unresolved. Maybe identity is partly memory. Maybe it is partly personality. Maybe it is something deeper that cannot be measured. Or maybe the important thing is not deciding exactly what survives, but recognizing that something can survive without preserving everything. That idea becomes even more powerful when we compare Finn's reincarnation with Simon's transformation. Finn and Simon experience almost opposite problems. Finn moves from one identity into another without remembering the previous one. Simon remains in the same body while his identity is gradually replaced by something else. Finn becomes someone new while carrying something old. Simon remains physically continuous while losing the person he used to be. And eventually, both stories ask the same question: what makes someone themselves? For Finn, the answer seems to be something that continues even after death. For Simon, the answer is something that can be damaged even while the body survives. For Marceline, the answer is something built from memory and relationships. For the elementals, the answer may be a force that exists independently of the individual. Adventure Time never forces these answers into one system. Instead, it allows them to overlap. That is why Finn's past lives are not just a fun explanation for a few recurring visual details. They are one of the foundations of the show's larger mythology. Once we know Finn has lived before, every ancient mystery involving identity, power, and recurrence becomes more interesting. We start looking at the world differently because we know that the present is not necessarily the first version of itself. And there is one final reason the Catalyst comment matters here. The comment does not only connect Finn to his previous lives, it connects him to the possibility of transformation itself. Something arrives from the outside ordinary world, and when it does, the rules of existence produce something new. Sometimes that new thing becomes a hero. Sometimes it becomes a monster. Sometimes it may become something that is neither. The universe does not appear to preserve one moral direction. It preserves the cycle. Finn happens to be one of its most hopeful expressions. The Lich is one of its most terrifying. And somewhere between those extremes are countless other beings whose stories have disappeared completely, leaving behind only traces in the ruins of Oo. That brings us back to the ancient elementals, because Evergreen's story shows us that long before Finn was running across the land of Oo, another generation was already dealing with the same cosmic forces. They didn't know Finn. They could have not known the kingdoms that would eventually replace their civilization. Yet one decision of theirs would survive long enough to affect Simon thousands of years later. The Ice Crown is therefore more than an ancient artifact. It is evidence. Evidence that the past can survive without its people. Evidence that one decision can travel farther than its creator ever could. And evidence that the world Finn was born into was already carrying the consequences of forgotten lives. Evergreen stands at the beginning of that chain, and his story takes us into an ooze so old that even the ruins Finn eventually explores would have been unrecognizable to him. It's a world where the elementals were not legends, where the forces of ice, fire, candy, and slime existed in forms far removed from the characters we know, and where one desperate attempt to protect the planet would eventually create the object responsible for one of Adventure Time's greatest tragedies. Finn's past lives show us that a person can return. Evergreen shows us that an influence can remain. And the next question is what happens when an entire elemental age disappears, while the powers belonging to that age somehow manage to survive? Long before Finn was born, before the Candy Kingdom became the center of Ooh, and before Simon Petrikov ever placed the ice crown on his head, there was a version of the world that would have been almost impossible for Finn to recognize. The landscape was different, the people were different, and the forces shaping civilization were already far older than anything Finn would eventually encounter. This is the world of Evergreen, and his story matters because it gives us one of the earliest glimpses into the history that existed beneath the history of Adventure Time. We normally think of Ooh as the aftermath of the Mushroom War, a strange world that emerged from the ruins of modern civilization. But Evergreen proves that even that ancient history is relatively recent. Thousands of years before Finn's adventures, the world was already filled with powerful beings who understood magic as something fundamental rather than unusual. They did not think of themselves as legends because they were living in the present. They simply happened to live in an age that later generations would almost completely forget. Evergreen is especially important because he is one of the first characters who allows us to see the elementals before they became the mysterious forces represented by characters like Princess Bubblegum, Flame Princess, and Slime Princess. He is an ice elemental, but the word elemental means more here than simply someone who happens to possess ice powers. Evergreen belongs to an ancient system of power that existed before the modern kingdoms of Ooh and appears to be connected to the fundamental forces of the world itself. He is therefore not just an old wizard. He is evidence that the powers we see in modern Ooh have roots that stretch far beyond the civilization Finn knows. And yet, Evergreen himself is not particularly wise. That is one of the first things that makes his story so interesting. When we imagine an ancient character who has lived in a magical world for thousands of years, it is easy to assume that he must possess some profound understanding of life, morality, and responsibility. Evergreen does not fit that image. He is arrogant, impatient, demanding, and extremely confident in his own abilities. His immense power has not automatically made him emotionally mature. In fact, one of the central problems in his story is that he is so convinced that he knows what is best that he rarely considers how his decisions affect the people around him. His relationship with Gunther makes this especially obvious. Evergreen wants Gunther to become stronger, more disciplined, and more useful. But his expectations are so rigid that he struggles to see Gunther as an individual. He evaluates him according to what he thinks an apprentice should be, rather than trying to understand the person standing in front of him. This becomes important because Evergreen's greatest mistake is not simply a magical mistake. It is a failure of judgment, and that failure eventually produces one of the most consequential objects in Adventure Time. The object is the Ice Crown. The circumstances surrounding its creation are enormous. Evergreen learns that the Catalyst Comet is approaching, and unlike the ordinary people of later Ooh who would know the comet only as a mysterious cosmic event, Evergreen understands that its arrival could have catastrophic consequences. The same cosmic cycle we encountered through Finn's past lives is already present here, thousands of years earlier. That connection alone changes the way we should think about Finn's reincarnation. The comet is not something that suddenly appears during Finn's lifetime. It has been moving through the universe across enormous periods of time, intersecting with different civilizations and different generations. Evergreen therefore finds himself facing a problem that is far beyond the normal scale of his life. He knows something enormous is coming, and his instinct is to stop it. That instinct is understandable. The problem is the method he chooses. Evergreen decides that the answer is to create an artifact powerful enough to confront the comet, and the crown becomes the vessel for that power. But the crown is not simply a neutral weapon. It contains a curse that affects the mind of whoever wears it, gradually replacing their identity with the personality associated with the crown. Evergreen's intention may have been protection, but the object he creates carries consequences that will not be understood until thousands of years later. This is one of the most important ideas in the entire story, because it shows how Adventure Time treats the relationship between intention and consequence. Evergreen is not trying to create the Ice King. He is not trying to destroy Simon Petrikov. He is not trying to cause the suffering that eventually surrounds the crown, yet those things become part of the object's history anyway. The person who creates something cannot always control what that thing becomes once it leaves their hands. And that is exactly what happens. Evergreen civilization disappears. The ancient world changes. The Mushroom War eventually arrives much later. Human civilization rises and falls, and the crown remains. Thousands of years can pass while an object waits for the next person to find it. This is where Evergreen's story connects beautifully with Finn's past lives. Finn represents continuity through identity, while the Ice Crown represents continuity through an object. In Finn's case, something belonging to a person survives death and eventually appears in another life. In the crown's case, something created by one person survives long after that person has vanished and eventually changes the life of someone who has no connection to its creator. Both are examples of the same larger principle. The past does not need to remain visible in order to remain influential. Simon has no reason to know Evergreen's name. He does not need to know anything about the ancient elementals. He does not need to understand why the crown was created. All he needs to do is put it on. And once he does, thousands of years of history suddenly become part of his life. That makes the Ice Crown one of the most important archaeological objects in Adventure Time. It is not merely an artifact from the past. It is a piece of the past that still actively changes the present. When Simon discovers it, he thinks he has found an object. He has actually found a decision made by someone who died thousands of years ago. The crown therefore carries more than magical power. It carries consequence. This is also why Evergreen's relationship with Gunther becomes so important. Evergreen is constantly focused on the enormous external problem represented by the Catalyst Comet, but his personal relationships reveal how poorly he understands responsibility on a smaller scale. He wants to save the world while struggling to treat the person closest to him with patience and understanding. The irony is almost painful. He is willing to create an artifact capable of influencing the fate of the entire planet, but he doesn't fully understand the consequences of the choices he makes in his own relationships. That contradiction is part of what makes him feel like a real character rather than a simple piece of lore. He is powerful enough to influence history, but flawed enough to make decisions that history later interprets very differently. And there is another layer to the story that becomes clearer when we remember what the elementals actually represent. Evergreen is not just one powerful individual who happens to use ice. He is part of an elemental lineage that continues long after his death. The force he represents eventually appears again in different forms, which means that his disappearance does not mean the disappearance of ice as an elemental power. His individual identity is lost, but the force survives. That distinction becomes crucial. Finn's previous life as Shoko suggests that something about a person can continue into another person. Evergreen suggests something different. A power can continue even when the original person is gone. This is why modern elementals are so fascinating. When Princess Bubblegum, Flame Princess, and the others appear, they are not necessarily discovering their powers for the first time in the history of Ooh. They are participating in something ancient. The personalities are new, but the forces are not. The ancient world therefore becomes a kind of foundation underneath modern Ooh. Finn walks through forests that did not exist in Evergreen's time. The Candy Kingdom eventually rises in a world where Evergreen civilization has vanished. Simon finds the crown long after its creator is dead. Patient Saint Pym survives from the ancient age into the modern one, and the elemental powers continue appearing through different generations.
Once you look at the timeline this way, the Mushroom War becomes less like the beginning of Wu and more like one chapter in a much larger story. The war was catastrophic for humanity, but it did not erase everything that existed before it. Ancient magic survived. Ancient beings survived. Ancient artifacts survived. Some knowledge survived. Some forces survived. Even the fundamental patterns of the world survived. The world changed, but it did not start over completely. That is a very important distinction. Adventure Time's post-apocalyptic setting initially encourages us to imagine that the Mushroom War destroyed almost everything, and that modern Wu emerged from the ashes. But Evergreen's story shows that the world had already gone through enormous changes before humanity ever reached its technological peak. Civilizations had risen and disappeared. The elementals had existed for ages. Cosmic events had already occurred. Magic had already shaped the planet. The Mushroom War was one transformation among many, and that makes the ancient elementals feel less like an isolated fantasy concept and more like one of the oldest layers of the world. There is also something strangely tragic about Evergreen's role in all of this, because he never gets to see the consequences of his decision. He does not know Simon. He never watches the Ice King appear. He never sees Marceline encounter Simon. He never sees Finn and Jake walking through a world shaped partly by his creation. He never knows that an artifact designed to save the planet will eventually become one of the objects responsible for a man's psychological destruction. That is the nature of history. Most people never see the full consequences of what they do. A decision can outlive the person who made it by centuries. A building can remain standing after everyone who built it is gone. A weapon can be discovered by someone who has no idea why it was created. A story can survive after its original meaning has been forgotten. Evergreen's life therefore becomes another example of the same idea that appeared in Finn's reincarnation. Continuity does not require awareness. Shoko did not know she would become part of Finn's story. Evergreen did not know his crown would become part of Simon's. The people involved do not have to understand the future for the connection to exist. And this is where Patience St. Pym becomes so important, because unlike Evergreen, Patience survives. She is not merely remembered through an artifact or a story. She physically carries herself from the ancient world into a later age. She is one of the rare characters who can directly compare the world of the ancient elementals with the modern world of Wu because she has actually experienced both. That gives her a perspective almost nobody else possesses. Imagine waking up after an enormous period of time and realizing that almost everything you knew was gone. The people are gone, the civilization is gone, the customs are gone. The world you understood has been replaced by another world that may contain familiar forces but unfamiliar meanings. You remember a time when the elementals were part of ordinary life, while the people around you may treat those same powers as strange or legendary. Patience is therefore more than an ancient character. She is a surviving piece of context. She remembers enough to know that modern Wu does not fully understand what came before it. And that makes her existence incredibly valuable when trying to understand the elementals. Because the ancient world did not simply vanish. Somebody remembers it. Patience's survival also introduces another question about the difference between surviving and belonging. A person can remain alive while becoming completely disconnected from the world that once gave their life meaning. Patience has survived the disappearance of her civilization, but that does not mean she has successfully carried that civilization into the future. She brings memories with her, but memories are not the same as an entire culture. The people who shared her assumptions are gone. The institutions she knew are gone. The world that made her worldview feel normal has disappeared. This makes her one of the most unusual forms of time traveler in Adventure Time.
She has not traveled through time because she possesses a machine. She has simply endured long enough to reach an age that should have been completely inaccessible to her. And that means she can look at modern Wu and recognize things that everyone else has forgotten. The strange part is that recognition does not necessarily make her happier. Knowledge of the past can become a burden when nobody else shares it. Patience knows what the elementals were capable of. She knows how old their powers are. She knows that the modern world is standing on top of layers of history that its inhabitants barely understand. But she also has to deal with the fact that the people of modern Wu are not the people of her time. They have developed their own cultures, personalities, and ways of understanding magic. The past cannot simply walk into the present and demand that the present become the past again. That is the same problem Betty eventually faces with Simon. Betty wants Simon back exactly as he was. Patience wants a world that no longer exists to remain meaningful. Finn carries a past he cannot remember. Marceline carries a past she cannot escape. And all of them are dealing with the same basic problem from different directions. How do you live when time refuses to move backward? Evergreen's answer was to fight the future with power. Betty's answer will eventually be to fight reality itself. Marceline's answer is to carry her memories while building something new. Finn's answer is simply to keep living. And Patience stands somewhere in between all of them, because she is literally carrying the ancient world into the modern one. This is why the Forgotten Elementals deserve more attention than simply being treated as another piece of Adventure Time trivia. They show that the history of Wu is not a straight line from the Mushroom War to Finn. It's a series of layers, with older civilizations buried beneath newer ones, and ancient forces continuing to appear in forms that future generations barely recognize. The elemental powers, therefore, are almost like geological layers of the world. You can't always see them, you may not know where they came from, but they are still underneath everything. And once modern Wu begins producing its own elementals, the connection becomes even more fascinating. Princess Bubblegum, Flame Princess, Slime Princess, and the others are not simply powerful individuals who happen to possess similar abilities. Their existence suggests that the elemental forces themselves have continued across the centuries, even as the civilization that first understood them disappeared. The people changed, the world changed, the powers remained. And that is where the story of the elementals becomes connected to Finn's past lives in a way that is easy to miss. Both systems are built around recurrence, but they preserve different things. Finn's reincarnation preserves something connected to an individual soul. The elementals preserve something connected to a force. One returns as a person, the other returns through different people. The question is whether the difference actually matters. If Finn can return without remembering Shoko, and an elemental can return without remembering Evergreen, then perhaps Adventure Time is suggesting that memory is not the only form of continuity. Something deeper can survive. The problem is that we can't always identify exactly what that something is. And that mystery is what makes the next part of the story so important. Because once we move from Evergreen and Patience into the modern elementals, we begin to see how these ancient forces were transformed by the people who inherited them. The old world did not simply disappear. It left descendants, it left powers, it left artifacts, and it left a question that modern Wu never fully answers. If the same elemental forces keep returning through completely different people, are those people inheriting the powers of the past, or are the powers themselves choosing new identities? That distinction may seem small at first, but it changes everything about how we understand the elementals. Patient St. Pim is one of the strangest characters in Adventure Time because she gives us something that almost no other character can provide: a direct connection to a world that should have disappeared completely. When Finn meets her, she is not telling stories about an ancient civilization that she studied in a book, and she is not repeating legends passed down through generations. She was actually there. She remembers a time when the elementals were not mysterious figures buried inside the mythology of Wu, but living forces that shaped the world around them. She remembers a civilization whose understanding of magic was completely different from the one Finn grew up with, and she carries that knowledge into a future where almost nobody understands what has been lost. Her existence, therefore, changes the meaning of the ancient elementals. Evergreen shows us the beginning of one of their stories, but Patience shows us what it means when that entire world becomes history, while one of its inhabitants refuses to disappear with it. When Patience St. Pym first appears, she immediately feels out of place. She does not speak or behave like someone who belongs to modern Wu, and that is not simply because she is eccentric. She genuinely comes from another era. The assumptions she makes about magic, power, and the elementals were formed in a world where those things were much more familiar. Modern Wu has its own magical traditions, but the ancient elementals seem to have understood their powers as part of a much larger structure. Patience knows what that structure looked like because she experienced it before the world changed. That makes her survival more significant than it initially appears. A person can preserve information in many ways. A book can survive, a monument can survive, an artifact can survive. A story can change as people retell it. An artifact can remain intact while its purpose becomes completely unknown. Patience is different because she herself is the source. Her memories come from direct experience, and when she describes the ancient elementals, she is not reconstructing the past, she is remembering it. The problem is that remembering something does not bring it back. This is one of the most important distinctions in her story. Patience can tell modern Wu what the elementals were like, but she cannot recreate the civilization that surrounded them. The people who shared her world are gone. The institutions that gave those powers meaning are gone. The culture that allowed those abilities to exist as part of ordinary life has disappeared. She has survived the destruction of her era, but she has not preserved the era itself. That creates an unusual kind of loneliness. Patience is surrounded by people, but almost none of them can understand the world she came from because they did not experience it. She has knowledge that is impossible to fully communicate. Even if she explains every detail, the listener still approaches it from a completely different historical position. Finn can hear about the ancient elementals, but he cannot experience what it was like to live among them. Princess Bubblegum can study ancient magical systems, but studying them is not the same as growing up inside them. This is why Patience is more than a source of exposition. She represents the emotional consequence of surviving history. There's something unsettling about being the last person who remembers something that mattered enormously to everyone around you, because eventually you realize that the thing you are remembering may exist only inside your own mind. The world can forget an entire civilization while one person continues carrying it. Patience, therefore, becomes almost like a living archive, but an archive that can feel, make mistakes, become angry, and develop her own agenda. And her agenda is important because she does not simply want to tell modern Wu about the past, she wants to use what she knows. This is where the ancient elementals become more complicated. Their powers are not presented as harmless historical curiosities. They can be incredibly destructive, and Patience understands that better than almost anyone. She has seen what elemental power can do when concentrated in people who already possess enormous abilities. She knows that these forces can reshape the world, and she does not necessarily approach that knowledge with the same caution that modern Wu might. Her attitude makes more sense when we remember where she came from. To Patience, the elementals are not legends. They are the normal framework through which she understands power. Modern characters may see their abilities as extraordinary, but Patience remembers a world where extraordinary power was part of the structure of society. That difference in perspective explains why she can behave so confidently, even when everyone around her thinks she is taking enormous risks. At the center of this ancient world is the elemental city, a place that helps us understand just how different the old civilization was. The city is important not simply because it is old, but because it gives physical form to the idea that the elementals once belonged to an organized culture. They were not isolated characters scattered randomly across the landscape. There was a world around them, a system that connected them, and an understanding of their powers that modern Wu has largely lost. The ruins of that world are therefore incredibly important. Whenever Adventure Time shows us ancient locations, it's tempting to focus on the visual mystery of them, But the more interesting question is what kind of society produced those structures? What did people believe? How did they understand the elementals? What was considered normal? What happened to all of that knowledge? The answer is not given in one clean historical explanation, and that is part of what makes the ancient city so fascinating. Adventure Time gives us fragments rather than a complete textbook history. We see enough to understand that something substantial existed, but not enough to reconstruct every detail. That mirrors the way real archaeological history works. You find a building, an inscription, a tool, a weapon, and suddenly you have evidence of a civilization that can no longer explain itself. Patience is the closest thing Wu has to an archaeologist who was actually alive during the period being studied, and yet even she cannot restore everything. This is where her relationship with the other elementals becomes especially revealing. Modern elementals, such as Princess Bubblegum and Flame Princess, have no direct memory of living in the ancient world, but they carry forces that seem to correspond with those ancient identities. To Patience, the elemental powers are part of a continuity. To them, the powers are simply part of who they are. That difference creates a fascinating tension between inheritance and identity. Imagine meeting someone thousands of years after your civilization disappeared and realizing that they possess the same fundamental power that you once considered uniquely yours. They don't remember you. They don't know the culture you came from. They may not even understand why their powers resemble yours. Yet when they use that power, you recognize something immediately. Patience's reaction to the modern elementals can be understood as a mixture of recognition and frustration. She can see the connection, but she cannot make the modern world become the ancient world again. The people are different, and that difference matters. This is another place where the story parallels Finn. Finn is connected to Shoko, but Finn is not Shoko. Modern elementals may be connected to ancient elementals, but they are not simply the same individuals walking around with different faces. The recurring pattern preserves something while allowing something else to change. That may actually be one of the most important rules in Adventure Time's mythology. The world repeats itself without perfectly repeating its people. The elementals are particularly good evidence for this, because their powers are recognizable even when their personalities are completely different. The ancient ice elemental and the modern ice elemental are connected by something fundamental, but Simon's experience with the ice crown introduces another complication. The crown was created by Evergreen, yet the person who eventually wears it becomes the Ice King, and the Ice King is not simply Evergreen reborn. He is a completely different person whose life is transformed by an ancient object. This gives us three different kinds of continuity. Finn carries something forward through reincarnation. The elementals carry something forward through recurring elemental forces. The ice crown carries something forward through an artifact. All three systems allow the past to affect the present, but none of them preserve the past perfectly. That distinction becomes increasingly important as we move deeper into the elemental mythology. Because the ancient city is not simply a place where powerful people lived. It is evidence of a civilization that understood these recurring forces in a way modern Wu no longer does. And perhaps that is why Patience feels so dangerous. She has knowledge without the cultural limitations that modern Wu has developed around that knowledge. She remembers what these forces can do, but she does not necessarily share the modern world's assumptions about how they should be used. She sees the potential of the elementals, and she is willing to manipulate them in ways that modern characters might consider unacceptable. The irony is that her attempt to preserve the old world can contribute to the destruction of what remains of it. This is one of the recurring tragedies in Adventure Time. Characters often try to protect something by controlling it, and the attempt at control creates the very consequences they were trying to avoid. Evergreen creates the ice crown because he wants to protect the world from the Catalyst Comet, but the crown eventually causes Simon's transformation. Betty wants to save Simon, but her obsession ultimately leads her toward a sacrifice that prevents her from simply returning to her old life. Patience wants to preserve or restore an elemental understanding of the world, but her methods demonstrate how dangerous that knowledge can become when separated from the culture that originally developed it. The past is not automatically safer simply because it is old. That is a crucial point. Modern Wu often romanticizes ancient things. Ruins look mysterious. Ancient artifacts look powerful. Old civilizations seem wiser because their secrets have survived, while their mistakes have been forgotten. But Patience provides the missing perspective. She remembers the people, not just the ruins. She remembers the power, not just the mythology. And once you see the ancient world through someone who actually lived there, it becomes much harder to idealize it. Evergreen was powerful and deeply flawed. The ancient elementals were extraordinary, but they were not necessarily peaceful. Their civilization had knowledge, but knowledge did not prevent destruction. The existence of advanced magical understanding did not make the ancient world immune to loss. In some ways, it may have made the consequences of failure even greater. This becomes especially interesting when we return to the Catalyst Comet. The comet is the event that forces Evergreen to create the crown, but it also represents something larger than one disaster. It is part of the recurring cosmic cycle that we connected to Finn in the previous sections. That means the ancient elementals were living inside the same universe of recurring cosmic events that eventually produces Finn's reincarnation and the Lich. Patience's world was therefore not isolated from the rest of Adventure Time's mythology. It was one of the earliest stages of it. The same cosmic forces were already moving through the universe. The same cycles were already operating. The same basic problem of change was already present. The elementals were simply experiencing it in a different age. And this is where the ancient city becomes almost symbolic. It is a physical reminder that even enormous civilizations can become archaeological evidence. A place can once have been the center of a powerful culture and eventually become something that future generations barely recognize. Its people can disappear. Its language can disappear. Its political structures can disappear. Its understanding of magic can disappear. But the elemental forces themselves continue. That is what makes the elementals different from ordinary historical civilizations. A kingdom can die completely. A culture can disappear. But the force of ice can still return. Fire can still return. Candy can still return. Slime can still return. The civilization disappears, but something fundamental remains available for the next generation. This is why it is useful to compare the elementals to Finn's reincarnation cycle. Finn's soul continues even though each individual life ends. The elemental forces continue even though each individual elemental eventually disappears. In both cases, the series creates continuity without requiring permanent physical survival. The difference is that Finn's cycle is personal. The elemental's force cycle is environmental. Finn's previous life matters because it was his. The elemental force matters because it exists beyond any one person. And Patience is caught between these two ideas because she is one of the few individuals who remembers the original people who carried those forces. That gives her a unique position in the mythology. She is not merely looking at the past from the outside. She is someone the past is still alive inside. But eventually, even Patience has to face the fact that she cannot force the modern world to become what she remembers. This is one of the quieter themes running underneath her entire story. Time does not simply destroy things, it changes their meaning. The elementals that once represented one kind of civilization can become something completely different when placed into another civilization. A power can remain while its cultural context disappears. A character can survive while everyone who understood them is gone. A memory can remain accurate while becoming irrelevant to the world around it. And that is why the ancient elementals are so important to understanding Wu. They are not simply evidence that magic existed a long time ago. They are evidence that the meaning of magic can change even when the magic itself survives. Modern U inherits the powers without inheriting the entire civilization that created the original framework around them. That is why the modern elementals behave so differently. Princess Bubblegum does not think like an ancient candy elemental. Flame Princess is not simply repeating an ancient personality. The world has changed enough that the same forces can produce completely different lives. And that brings us to the next stage of the story. If Finn's reincarnation shows us that one soul can return without its memories, and Patience shows us that an entire civilization can disappear while its powers remain, then the modern elementals give us the chance to see what happens when those ancient forces are placed into new personalities. That is where Princess Bubblegum, Flame Princess, Slime Princess, and the other elementals become more than separate characters. They become the modern expressions of something that began thousands of years before Finn was born.
There is a point in Adventure Time where the entire story of Simon Petrikov stops being about whether he can be saved and becomes something much more frightening. The possibility that saving him may require changing the nature of reality itself. Betty has already spent years trying to understand the Ice King, trying to separate Simon from the crown, trying to find a way to restore the person she loved without destroying what remained of him. By the time she reaches the end of her story, ordinary solutions are no longer enough. Simon has become something that cannot simply be separated from his past with a spell or a scientific experiment, and Betty has become someone who is willing to go farther than almost anyone else would go to fix that problem. What makes her final plan so interesting is that it was never really about defeating Golb in the traditional sense. Betty's objective was much more specific. She wanted to change the conditions that allowed Simon to become the Ice King in the first place, and eventually she realizes that the only being powerful enough to make that possible is the same cosmic entity that represents chaos, destruction, and the limits of understanding. To understand why Betty becomes obsessed with Golb, we have to go back to the beginning of her relationship with Simon. When she first meets him, he is simply Simon Petrikov, an intelligent and curious man with a fascination for ancient objects. He is not yet the Ice King, and there is no reason for Betty to believe that her relationship with him will eventually become a struggle spanning thousands of years. The tragedy is that Betty does not lose Simon in one dramatic moment. She watches him disappear gradually. The crown changes him, first in small ways, and then in ways that become impossible to ignore. His memories deteriorate, his personality changes, and eventually the person Betty originally knew is almost completely inaccessible. That kind of loss is different from ordinary grief because the person is physically present. Betty can still see Simon, but Simon is no longer capable of being the same person she remembers. This creates the central problem that drives her entire future. How do you save someone who is still alive but has become someone else? At first, Betty approaches the problem like a scientist. She searches for explanations. She studies the crown. She looks for methods that might restore Simon's mind. This makes sense because Simon himself approached the world through knowledge. If something was wrong, there should theoretically be an explanation, and if there was an explanation, perhaps there was a solution. Betty inherits that way of thinking, but there is a major difference between them. Simon eventually realizes that the crown is dangerous, while Betty becomes increasingly convinced that there must be some way around its consequences. The strange part is that Betty's intelligence becomes both her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. She is capable of understanding problems that ordinary people cannot even perceive, but that also means she can continue searching for solutions long after most people would accept that the problem cannot be solved. Her persistence begins as love, but over time it becomes something much more complicated. She is no longer simply trying to help Simon. She is trying to undo history. And history in Adventure Time is rarely willing to cooperate. This is why Golb becomes relevant.
Golb is not simply another powerful villain waiting somewhere in the universe. The series presents Golb as a force associated with chaos, destruction, and the limits of understanding. Golb operates on a scale that makes most of the conflicts in Ooze seem almost insignificant. The Lich can destroy worlds, ancient elementals can reshape civilizations, and the Mushroom War can transform an entire planet. But Golb exists on another level entirely. That makes Betty's decision to involve herself with Golb incredibly dangerous. She is not looking for a stronger version of the same magic she has already tried. She is looking outside the normal rules of the world. This is important because Betty eventually realizes that Simon cannot simply be returned to his old life while the crown's curse remains part of his history. The problem is not just the crown itself. The problem is everything that happened because of it. Simon became the Ice King. The Ice King existed for thousands of years. He developed relationships, enemies, habits, and memories of his own. Marceline's childhood is connected to him. The history of Ooze contains his presence. Removing the Ice King from that history would not simply repair Simon, it would alter countless other lives. That is why the problem becomes almost impossible to solve. Betty wants to restore one person, but that person has become part of the history of an entire world. This is something Adventure Time has already taught us through the stories of Finn's past lives and the ancient elementals. The past is not isolated. One decision can move through thousands of years. Evergreen creates the Ice Crown because he wants to prevent the Catalyst Comet from destroying the world, and the consequences eventually reach Simon. Simon becomes the Ice King, and his existence affects Marceline, Finn, Bubblegum, and countless other characters. Finn's previous life as Shoko demonstrates the same principle from another direction. A person can disappear, but something about them can continue into the future. Betty is confronted with the same interconnected history, but she does not want to accept it. She wants to reach backward and change it. This is where her plan becomes more than just a love story. It becomes a philosophical problem about whether the past should be changed simply because we know the suffering it produced. Betty knows what happened to Simon. She knows what the crown did. She knows how much pain he experienced. From her perspective, the obvious answer is to prevent the tragedy from happening at all. But if she succeeds, then the Simon she saves may never become the Simon she remembers. This is the paradox sitting underneath her entire mission. She wants to save the man who existed before the crown, but her desperation eventually pushes her towards actions that make it increasingly difficult to preserve Betty herself. She is sacrificing pieces of her own identity in pursuit of a version of Simon that no longer exists. And that's exactly where her relationship with Golb becomes so tragic. Betty does not approach Golb because she worships chaos or because she wants to destroy Ooze. She approaches Golb because she believes that an entity operating outside ordinary reality might possess the power required to accomplish what normal magic cannot. She is effectively looking for a loophole in existence. The problem is that there may be no such thing as a safe loophole when dealing with Golb. Golb represents something that cannot simply be reasoned with in the same way Betty reasons with scientists, wizards, or magical beings. Betty's greatest strength is her ability to understand systems, identify weaknesses, and develop plans. But Golb exists outside the kind of system she is accustomed to manipulating. There is no simple equation that allows Betty to calculate exactly what will happen when she enters Golb's domain. And yet, she goes anyway. This is one of the most important details about Betty's character because it shows how far her obsession has taken her. Earlier in her life, she is defined by curiosity and intelligence. Later, those same qualities become tools for pursuing Simon at any cost. She is willing to investigate increasingly dangerous forces because the possibility of restoring him is more important to her than her own safety. That makes Betty's eventual encounter with Golb very different from a conventional hero versus villain confrontation. She is not trying to defeat Golb because Golb has personally wronged her. She is trying to use Golb's power to solve a problem that has become too large for her. And eventually, she understands that Golb cannot simply be controlled.
This is where the final stage of Betty's plan becomes so fascinating. Rather than defeating Golb through brute force, Betty seeks a transformation that will allow her to protect Simon from the consequences of his own history. She becomes Golb herself. Or more precisely, she merges with Golb in a way that fundamentally changes her existence. On the surface, this looks like a victory. Betty achieves something extraordinary. She becomes powerful enough to affect the situation surrounding Simon. But emotionally, the result is much more complicated because Betty does not get the simple ending she wanted. She does not return to the beginning. She does not simply erase the crown. She does not get to become the same Betty who first met Simon. Instead, she becomes something else. This is the crucial recontextualization of her entire story. Betty spends so much of her life trying to restore the past that she eventually becomes one of the greatest examples of why the past cannot simply be restored. Her love for Simon survives, but Betty herself is transformed by the attempt to preserve it. And Simon eventually gets something Betty wanted for him: freedom from the Ice King's identity. But it comes at a cost. When Simon returns to himself, he has to confront the reality that Betty is no longer the person she once was. She sacrificed herself to make his restoration possible. The person who spent thousands of years trying to save him has become inaccessible to him. This creates one of the most painful reversals in the entire series. Betty succeeds in saving Simon, but she cannot remain beside him to experience the result. She solves the problem and loses the future she imagined. That is why her story fits so naturally with the larger themes we have already been following. Finn's reincarnation shows that identity can continue without memory. The elementals show that power can continue while the civilization surrounding it disappears. Betty's story shows something different. Love can continue even after the person who originally expressed it has been transformed beyond recognition. And there's an important detail about Golb that makes this even stranger. Golb is associated with chaos, but Betty's entire personality is built around order. She wants to understand things, she wants to plan, she wants predictable results, she wants to solve problems. Her attempt to defeat or manipulate Golb therefore places the most control-oriented character in the series directly against the force that represents the limits of control. In a sense, Betty spends her entire life trying to prove that there must be an answer. Golb is the moment when she discovers that the answer may require surrendering the person she was. That is why her final transformation should not simply be interpreted as Betty becoming more powerful. It is the culmination of a character arc in which her desire to control the outcome eventually consumes the boundaries of her own identity. And this is also why Simon's reaction afterwards matters so much. For thousands of years, Simon's greatest tragedy was losing himself. Betty's tragedy is almost the opposite. She becomes so completely committed to saving Simon that she gradually loses herself. The two characters move in opposite directions. Simon loses his identity against his will. Betty gives hers away willingly. That parallel makes their story much more painful because neither person gets the future they originally wanted. Simon survives, but the world has changed and Betty is gone. Betty succeeds in saving Simon, but she can no longer live the ordinary life she wanted with him. The ending therefore refuses to give us a clean reward for sacrifice. Betty does not get a romantic reunion. Simon does not get to undo every consequence of the past. Instead, they receive something much more complicated. Simon gets another chance to live as himself, while Betty becomes part of a cosmic force far beyond ordinary human existence. And this is where the story of Gold connects back to Finn's past lives in a surprisingly subtle way. Finn's reincarnation suggests that identity can continue through change. Betty's transformation suggests that identity can also become something completely different. In both cases, the question is not whether a person remains physically identical.
The question is what, if anything, remains meaningful after transformation. Finn becomes someone new while carrying an ancient continuity. Betty becomes someone new while carrying the emotional purpose of the person she used to be. Neither situation fits neatly into the idea of a fixed identity. And that is why Adventure Time never gives us a simple definition of what a person is. The series instead keeps presenting situations that challenge the assumption that identity must remain stable. Shoko becomes part of Finn. Finn becomes something beyond his current life. Simon becomes the Ice King. The Ice King eventually becomes Simon again. Betty becomes something beyond Betty. The elementals appear through different individuals. Even the Lich exists across different versions of reality. The world is full of characters whose identities are not as permanent as they first appear. Betty's plan to defeat Gold therefore becomes one of the most extreme examples of the show's larger philosophy. She begins with the belief that the solution to Simon's suffering is to restore what was lost. She ends by accepting a transformation that makes restoration impossible for herself. That does not make her sacrifice meaningless. It makes it tragic. And perhaps that is the point. Adventure Time does not say that letting go means you stop caring. Betty never stops caring about Simon. What changes is what she is willing to become because of that love. Eventually, Simon has to live without her. And that is something Betty could never have planned for. For a character who spent so much of her life trying to control the future, the final irony is that the future is the one thing she cannot control. Her story ends not because she found a perfect solution, but because she finally reaches a point where the solution requires a sacrifice she cannot reverse. That is what makes Golb so important to the story. Golb is not merely the final obstacle between Betty and Simon. Golb represents the boundary beyond which Betty's usual methods stop working. Science cannot solve it. Planning cannot solve it in the way she imagined. The only way forward is transformation. And once Betty becomes part of that cosmic force, the story of Simon and Betty reaches its final stage. But the presence of Golb opens another question that is much larger than either of them. If Golb exists beyond the ordinary structures of Ooh, what else exists in the places where the rules of the world become unstable? What happens to beings who are not part of the ordinary kingdoms, civilizations, or elemental systems? And why does Adventure Time repeatedly connect some of its strangest characters to a place that seems to operate under completely different rules from the rest of Ooh? That place is the Night Sphere. And unlike the ancient elemental city, the Night Sphere is not simply a forgotten piece of Ooh's history. It is the world that exists alongside Ooh, with its own rulers, creatures, traditions, and dangers. It is the world that Marceline inherited through her father Hunson Abadir, and understanding it means understanding a part of Adventure Time that is easy to dismiss as a collection of demons and supernatural jokes. But the Night Sphere is much more than that. Because once we enter it, the story moves away from reincarnation and ancient civilizations and into something much more personal. What happens when a child grows up between two worlds and has to decide which one she actually belongs to? The Nightosphere is one of those parts of Adventure Time that seems almost completely separate from the rest of the story when you first encounter it. It has demons, strange creatures, a ruler who can casually threaten an entire population, and an atmosphere that feels much darker than the rest of Ooh. So it is easy to treat it as another magical location that exists mainly for Marceline's backstory. But the more we learn about the Nightosphere, the more important it becomes to understanding what Marceline actually inherited from her father, and why her childhood was so different from Finn's. The Nightosphere is not simply a place where demons live. It represents an entire world with its own rules, and Marceline's connection to it creates a strange contradiction in her identity. She is technically the daughter of its ruler, yet almost everything about the person she becomes seems to come from her attempts to distance herself from that world. That contradiction is already visible when we look at Hunson Abadir. He is powerful, ancient, and almost completely comfortable with the role he occupies. He does not behave like someone who needs to justify his authority, because he assumes his position is self-evident. The Nightosphere belongs to him, and the creatures living there recognize that power. Marceline, however, never seems particularly interested in becoming part of that hierarchy. She has access to a world that most people in Wu could barely imagine, but she spends much of her life building an identity that has very little to do with being the daughter of a demon lord. She plays music, travels around Wu, develops friendships, and eventually becomes one of the most emotionally complicated characters in the series. Her connection to the Nightosphere remains important, but it is something she carries rather than something she embraces. The interesting part is that this separation begins much earlier than her adult life. Marceline's childhood is shaped by the Mushroom War and its aftermath, which means she grows up in a world that has already lost most of the structures that would normally make childhood feel safe. When we see young Marceline wandering through the ruins of human civilization, she is not simply exploring an unusual environment. She is learning how to survive in a world where the old civilization is gone, and where supernatural creatures have become part of the new reality. Her father exists, but he is not the kind of parent who can give her the ordinary stability she needs. He is a ruler of another realm, and his priorities are fundamentally different from hers. This becomes especially clear in the episode where Marceline is given the hambo. The object itself becomes important later, but what matters first is what it represents when Marceline is young. She does not need a powerful magical artifact because she wants power. She needs something that can give her comfort. That distinction is important because it shows how differently Marceline understands the supernatural world compared to Hunson. To him, objects and creatures can be useful sources of power. To Marceline, an object can become emotionally valuable because of the person who gave it to her. The same magical world, therefore, has completely different meanings depending on who is looking at it. Hunson does not always understand that difference. His relationship with Marceline is complicated because there is clearly affection between them, but his understanding of affection is filtered through the values of the Nightosphere. He can provide food, protection, and power, yet he often fails to recognize what Marceline actually needs emotionally. When he interacts with her, he can treat the situation as though being her father is enough to establish a connection, while Marceline is looking for something more personal. She wants to be understood rather than simply protected. This is one of the reasons the Nightosphere becomes so useful for understanding Marceline. It gives us a physical representation of one side of her identity, while everything Marceline does throughout the series represents the other. She has demon blood, but she does not behave like Hunson. She has immense supernatural abilities, but she rarely seeks authority. She has access to an entire realm, but she spends most of her life moving through Wu. The question is not whether Marceline belongs to the Nightosphere. Technically, she does. The more interesting question is whether belonging somewhere automatically means becoming what that place expects you to become. Marceline's answer seems to be no. Her relationship with the Nightosphere becomes particularly interesting when she returns there as an adult. The environment is familiar, but she is not the same person she was when she first encountered it. She has spent centuries developing her own identity, and by the time she returns, she has already experienced things that her father cannot fully understand. She has lived through the aftermath of the Mushroom War. She has known Simon. She has lost people. She has developed friendships and relationships outside the demon world. The Nightosphere is part of her history, but it does not contain the whole of her history. That distinction matters because the Nightosphere itself is presented as a place where power is often treated as the most important form of value. Hunson's authority is based on his position and his supernatural strength, and many of the creatures around him seem to accept that hierarchy without questioning it. Marceline, however, repeatedly defines herself through relationships and personal choice. She does not want to rule people simply because she can. She wants to make music. She wants freedom. She wants to decide for herself what kind of person she is. This is why her conflict with Hunson is more complicated than a simple rebellious daughter versus authoritarian father story. Marceline is not rejecting him because she believes everything about him is evil. She rejects the parts of his worldview that make her feel as though affection can be replaced by power. She wants a father who understands her, not a ruler who assumes that his ability to provide for her automatically proves that he loves her in the way she needs. The Nightosphere, therefore, becomes one of the places where Adventure Time explores the difference between power and care. Hunson possesses enormous power, but his relationship with Marceline is often strained. Simon possesses very little conventional power when he first meets young Marceline, yet his relationship with her becomes one of the most meaningful connections of her childhood. Simon cannot give Marceline everything her father theoretically could provide. He cannot command armies or open portals to another dimension. What he can do is sit with her, listen to her, and try to protect her in a way that feels personal. That is why Marceline's connection to Simon is so important when we consider her relationship with the Nightosphere. She effectively finds a second form of parental care outside her father's world. Hunson represents one possible inheritance: immense power, supernatural authority, and the direct connection to the demon world. Simon represents something completely different: memory, companionship, music, and emotional attachment. Marceline grows up carrying both influences. She does not become a miniature version of either one. Instead, she becomes Marceline. That may sound obvious, but it is actually one of the most important patterns in Adventure Time's treatment of inherited identity. Finn inherits the consequences of previous lives, but does not become Shoko. Modern elementals inherit ancient forces but do not simply become their predecessors. Marceline inherits demon blood and a connection to the Nightosphere, but does not become Hunson. In each case, inheritance provides the starting point rather than the final identity. This is why the Nightosphere is more interesting when viewed through Marceline instead of its monsters. The creatures themselves are strange, but Marceline's relationship with them tells us something much more important about how Adventure Time treats family. Being related to someone does not guarantee that you will share their values. Being born into a particular world does not guarantee that you will belong there emotionally. And having access to enormous power does not mean that power will become the thing you value most. Hunson's relationship with Marceline also gives us another perspective on the larger theme of abandonment that runs through her story. Marceline loses her mother at a young age, grows up during the destruction of human civilization, and eventually becomes separated from Simon. Her father remains alive, but his presence is inconsistent in the way that matters most. This means Marceline repeatedly experiences a version of loss, where the person she cares about is not necessarily dead. Sometimes they are simply unreachable. That is one of the reasons Marceline develops such a strong attachment to objects and memories. Hambo becomes important because it represents someone who cared about her. Her bass guitar becomes important because it connects to her identity and her past. Songs become important because they allow her to preserve emotions that would otherwise be difficult to explain. Even her relationship with Bubblegum is shaped by memory, because their history exists long before the audience sees them together in the present. The Nightosphere, by contrast, is almost the opposite of all of that. It is a place where Marceline's identity is defined by bloodline and power. She is the daughter of Hunson Abadir, and that fact carries enormous significance there. But Marceline's life outside the Nightosphere shows that she does not want her identity reduced to her parentage. This becomes especially clear when Hunson attempts to involve himself in Marceline's life in ways she finds intrusive. His behavior can seem comedic because Adventure Time often presents him with an exaggerated personality, but underneath the comedy is a genuine problem between them. Hunson keeps assuming that he knows what is best for Marceline because he sees himself as her father and as one of the most powerful beings in existence. Marceline keeps rejecting that assumption because she has spent centuries discovering that she knows herself better than he does. Their conflict is therefore partly about control. Hunson wants to define Marceline through their relationship. Marceline wants to define herself independently. And the nightosphere represents the world that would exist if she allowed her father's definition to become her own. This is why her refusal to become a conventional demon ruler matters. She could potentially have inherited far more from Hunson than she does. She could have used her power to dominate others. She could have embraced the nightosphere and made it part of her identity. Instead, she chooses a much more ordinary kind of existence despite possessing extraordinary abilities. There is something almost ironic about that choice. The daughter of the ruler of a supernatural dimension spends much of her life acting like a wandering musician. She is interested in relationships, art, memories, and experiences. Her supernatural heritage is real, but it is not the center of her personality. And that is exactly what makes the nightosphere important to the larger mythology of Adventure Time. It demonstrates that the world is full of inherited identities that characters can either accept, reject, or transform. Finn's past lives are one version of that. The elementals are another. Marceline's demon heritage is another. The series keeps returning to the same basic question through different characters. How much of your identity is determined by where you came from, and how much of it is determined by what you choose to do with what you inherited? Marceline's answer is complicated because she never completely escapes her past. She still has her demon powers. She still has her connection to Hunson. She can still enter the nightosphere. She still carries the emotional consequences of her childhood. She cannot simply erase where she came from. But she also doesn't have to become it. That is an important distinction, especially in a series where characters are constantly dealing with ancient forces and inherited identities. The past can influence you without controlling you. A previous life can be part of your soul without dictating your personality. An elemental power can continue through generations without forcing each person to repeat the same life. A parent can pass down blood and history without determining the person their child becomes. The nightosphere gives us a darker version of that same idea. Marceline has inherited something dangerous, but she decides what it means. And this becomes even more interesting when we look at what the nightosphere actually represents within the cosmology of the show. It is not simply another country on the map. It is a separate realm with its own supernatural ecosystem, and that means Ooo is only part of the world Adventure Time has created. Characters can move between dimensions, realms can overlap, and supernatural beings can interact with ordinary people without the boundaries between their worlds remaining completely stable. That makes Marceline's childhood even stranger. She is not simply a human survivor who happens to have demon powers. She is someone whose life exists between multiple worlds. Her mother connects her to humanity. Her father connects her to the nightosphere. And the post-apocalyptic world connects her to the strange new civilization that emerges after the Mushroom War. She belongs to all three histories without completely belonging to any of them. This helps explain why Marceline often feels older than the characters around her. She is not merely older in years. She has lived through multiple versions of the world. She remembers the time before the kingdoms that Finn knows. She remembers the period immediately after the Mushroom War. She remembers Simon before he became the Ice King. She remembers her father and the nightosphere. Her personality is therefore shaped by the experience of constantly watching worlds change. And this brings us back to the larger question of identity that has been appearing throughout this script. Finn's past lives ask what survives when a person dies. Evergreen's story asks what survives when a civilization disappears. Betty's story asks what survives when love drives someone to transform themselves completely. Marceline's story asks what happens when you inherit a world you do not want to become part of. The nightosphere is therefore not a detour from the earlier topics. It gives us another way of understanding the same underlying idea. Adventure Time is fascinated by inheritance, but it rarely treats inheritance as destiny. Characters inherit powers, memories, bloodlines, responsibilities, curses, and relationships, but they still have to decide what those things mean. Marceline's relationship with Hudson is especially powerful because she doesn't need to deny that he is part of her history. She simply refuses to let him be the entire explanation for who she is. And perhaps that is why the Nightosphere remains so relevant, even after Marceline has spent most of her life away from it. The realm itself never disappears, and neither does the connection between Marceline and her father. But the longer Marceline lives outside that world, the more clearly we can see that her identity was never meant to be contained by it. She inherited the Nightosphere, but she built her life somewhere else. And once we understand that, the next part becomes much more interesting, because Marceline's story is not the only place where Adventure Time uses inheritance to create a conflict between what someone was supposed to become and what they actually become. The same pattern appears in Finn's story, in the Elementals, and most dramatically in the history of the world itself, where ancient forces continue resurfacing in characters who have no idea how much history they're carrying.
The Nightosphere becomes much more interesting once we stop looking at it as simply the place where demons live and start looking at what it tells us about Marceline's childhood. Hudson Abadir is not just a powerful father who happens to rule another dimension. He represents an entire inheritance that Marceline could have accepted as her identity. And the fact that she spends so much of her life resisting that inheritance tells us something important about her. Marceline is constantly surrounded by things that could define her before she ever has the chance to define herself. She is the daughter of a demon lord, the survivor of the Mushroom War, a vampire, and one of the oldest living people in Uu. Yet none of those descriptions completely explain her. The Nightosphere is therefore useful because it shows us the difference between what Marceline inherited and what she chose to become. Her relationship with Hudson makes this especially complicated because he is not simply an absent father. He is present enough to influence her, powerful enough to protect her, and connected to her strongly enough that she can never completely separate herself from him. The problem is that his idea of being a father does not always match what Marceline actually needs. Hudson tends to approach problems through power, and that makes sense considering the world he rules. In the Nightosphere, strength has obvious value. Authority is visible. A ruler who can dominate other demons has a clear position within the hierarchy. But Marceline grows up in circumstances where emotional security matters more than authority. She needs someone who can understand what she has lost, not simply someone who can tell her that she is protected. This is why Simon becomes so important during her childhood. Simon has almost none of the supernatural authority that Hudson possesses, yet he gives Marceline something that Hudson struggles to provide. He recognizes that she is a child living through circumstances no child should have to experience. He does not expect her to become stronger simply because the world is dangerous. Instead, he tries to give her moments in which she can still behave like a child. Their relationship is built around small things, and that makes it much more important than the size of the powers involved. A can of food, a stuffed toy, a song, or simply having someone nearby can matter more to Marceline than access to an entire supernatural kingdom. That contrast helps explain why Marceline's relationship with the Nightosphere never becomes the center of her life. The realm represents power, but her memories of Simon represent care. She may have inherited the first, but she emotionally attaches herself to the second. This distinction is one of the reasons Marceline becomes such a different character from Hudson despite sharing his supernatural heritage. There is also an important detail in the way Marceline's powers develop. She is not simply a demon because her father is one. She becomes a vampire after her own experiences, and her abilities develop through a completely different path. This gives her an identity that is effectively built from several different histories at once. Her demonic blood connects her to her father. Her humanity connects her to her mother and to the world that existed before the Mushroom War.
Her vampirism gives her another supernatural identity that is not simply inherited from either parent. Her friendship with Simon connects her to the remnants of human civilization. Later, her relationships with Finn, Bubblegum, and others connect her to modern Ooh. Marceline is therefore almost a living intersection of different versions of the world. That is why it would be too simple to describe her as someone who merely rejects her father. She actually carries pieces of everything she has experienced. Her music is partly connected to her memories. Her personality is shaped by centuries of survival. Her supernatural abilities are connected to both her family and her own experiences. Even the way she handles relationships reflects the fact that she has repeatedly experienced separation and loss. When she becomes emotionally distant, it is not simply because she is naturally aloof. She has spent an enormous amount of time learning that people can disappear, change, or become inaccessible. The Nightosphere contributes to this because it gives her a permanent reminder of a family connection that never completely disappears. Hudson can be frustrating, selfish, and emotionally insensitive, but he is still her father. Marceline cannot erase that fact. Even when she wants nothing to do with his world, the Nightosphere remains part of her history. This is another place where Adventure Time avoids giving us an easy answer about family. Hudson is not portrayed as a perfect father who secretly understands Marceline completely, but he is also not treated as a character who has no feelings for her. His affection exists alongside his failures. That combination makes their relationship more believable and also explains why Marceline can be angry with him without simply rejecting every part of him. The same complexity appears when Marceline returns to the Nightosphere. She is entering a place that is technically connected to her through blood, but she approaches it almost like an outsider. The creatures there recognize who she is, and Hudson recognizes her importance, but Marceline does not behave as though she has finally returned home. She is visiting a part of herself, rather than returning to the place where she belongs. That distinction becomes important when considering what home means in Adventure Time. Characters rarely have only one place that can be called home. Finn has the treehouse, but his sense of belonging is connected to his relationships and his adventures. Marceline has her cave, but her memories of Simon and the world before the Mushroom War remain. Princess Bubblegum has the Candy Kingdom, but her identity extends back hundreds of years before that kingdom existed. Simon's original home disappears entirely, yet the memories connected to it remain important. The Nightosphere adds another version of this idea because it is a place Marceline could technically claim as hers, but does not emotionally treat it as her primary home. This makes her relationship with Hudson particularly revealing. When a parent comes from a powerful or unique background, a child can inherit expectations without necessarily agreeing to them. Marceline could have been expected to become a ruler, a powerful demon, or an heir to the Nightosphere. Instead, she becomes a musician and a wanderer. Her refusal to follow that path is not simply rebellion for its own sake, it is an act of self-definition. That matters because Adventure Time repeatedly shows characters struggling with identities that existed before they had any choice in the matter. Finn has previous lives he never asked for. Bubblegum inherits the consequences of being an elemental. Flame Princess is born into a kingdom where her elemental nature determines how others treat her. Marceline is born into a family whose supernatural status could easily define her future. In each case, the character has to decide whether inheritance is destiny. Marceline's life suggests that it is not. She can acknowledge where she came from without becoming what that origin expects. That is also why her relationship with music is more significant than it might initially appear. Music gives Marceline a way to control her own narrative. She can take memories that are painful or confusing and turn them into something she chooses to express. Her songs frequently contain references to relationships, loneliness, anger, regret, and affection, and they allow her to communicate things she might not say directly. This becomes particularly important because Marceline has lived for so long that ordinary conversation cannot possibly contain everything she remembers. The Nightosphere gives her a family history, but music gives her a personal language. That difference helps explain why Marceline's identity feels so independent from Hudson's.
He has a realm. She has songs. He has authority. She has relationships. He defines himself through power. She defines herself through experience. And this is where the Night Sphere becomes connected to the larger history of Wu. The realm exists outside the ordinary kingdoms, but Marceline moves between it and Wu with relative ease. Her ability to exist in both worlds reinforces the idea that the boundaries between different histories are not as rigid as they initially appear. The post-Mushroom War world is not isolated from supernatural dimensions. Ancient magic continues to interact with modern civilization. Demons can enter Wu. Elementals can return. Cosmic entities can interfere with reality. The world of Adventure Time is constantly overlapping with older layers of existence. Marceline is one of the characters who makes that overlap feel personal. She is not simply someone who visits the Night Sphere. She is someone whose family comes from it. That makes her existence itself evidence that the worlds have been connected for a very long time. And there is another reason the Night Sphere matters when we think about Marceline's childhood. Hunson's realm provides a contrast to the human world that Marceline lost. Before the Mushroom War, humanity had cities, technology, families, schools, and ordinary institutions. After the war, Marceline grows up surrounded by ruins and supernatural creatures. Her father offers her access to a completely different kind of civilization, but that civilization is not human either. She therefore never gets a simple replacement for the world that disappeared. Instead, she develops between worlds. That helps explain why Marceline often feels comfortable around people who are themselves outsiders. She understands what it means to exist without fitting neatly into one category. Finn is human in a world where humans are rare. Bubblegum is technically a princess, but is also an experimenter and an immortal being with a complicated history. Simon becomes the Ice King and loses his original identity. Flame Princess is both a person and an elemental force. Marceline can relate to characters like these because she knows that a simple label rarely tells the entire story. The Night Sphere therefore becomes a kind of background pressure throughout Marceline's life. She does not need to spend every day thinking about it for it to matter. It is already part of her. Hunson does not need to be physically present for his influence to exist. Marceline knows what she inherited, and part of her development involves deciding what she will do with it. This is why her conflicts with Hunson often become emotional rather than purely physical. Marceline does not need to prove that she is stronger than him. She needs to prove that she is not obligated to become him. That is a much more personal conflict, and it explains why their disagreements can matter even when neither character is in immediate physical danger. Hunson's greatest mistake is often assuming that because he has the ability to provide something, Marceline must want it. He can offer power, status, access to the Night Sphere, and protection, but Marceline repeatedly demonstrates that those things are not what she values. She wants autonomy. She wants genuine connection. She wants to be treated as a person rather than as the heir to a supernatural throne. And that desire becomes particularly important because Marceline's life is already full of circumstances where she has very little control. She cannot control the Mushroom War. She cannot control her mother's death. She cannot control Simon's deterioration. She cannot control the passage of centuries. She cannot control the fact that people she cares about can change. But she can control how she responds to those things. Her independence is therefore not simply a personality trait. It is a survival mechanism. She learns to define herself because almost everything around her keeps changing. That makes the Night Sphere a useful counterpoint to Finn's story. Finn is constantly searching for his place in the world, but he has the advantage of being young enough to build his identity alongside the modern world of Wu. Marceline has already lived through several versions of that world. She has had to redefine herself repeatedly because the world around her keeps disappearing and being replaced. This is also why her immortality carries a different emotional weight from ordinary long life. Living for hundreds or thousands of years means that Marceline can accumulate experiences that younger characters cannot.
but it also means that she can accumulate losses. The longer she lives, the more history she carries, and the more difficult it becomes to explain that history to people who were not there. The Night Sphere is part of that history, but it is only one layer. The same Marceline who can enter the realm of demons is also the child who once wandered through the ruins of human civilization. The same person who can casually interact with supernatural creatures once depended on Simon for food and companionship. The same person who can stand up to Hudson once had to rely on others to survive. Those contradictions are not inconsistencies. They are the result of a very long life. And this brings us closer to the larger reason the Night Sphere belongs in a lore documentary like this one. It's easy to look at Adventure Time's supernatural worlds as separate pieces of mythology, but they often serve the same purpose. They show that Ooo is not a world where identity comes from one source. Characters are shaped by multiple histories at once, and sometimes those histories conflict. Marceline is one of the clearest examples because her family, species, relationships, and memories all point in different directions. Hudson connects her to the Night Sphere. Her mother connects her to humanity. The Mushroom War connects her to the post-apocalyptic history of Earth. Simon connects her to the lost world of pre-war civilization. Vampirism connects her to another supernatural tradition. Her music connects all of those experiences into something personal. None of these pieces completely defines her. That is precisely why the Night Sphere matters. It is not the answer to who Marceline is. It is one of the things she had to decide what to do with. And that same question will become even more important when we return to Finn, because his connection to past lives creates an even stranger version of inherited identity. Marceline remembers her past directly, even if she chooses not to talk about all of it. Finn does not have that luxury. His past lives exist somewhere beneath his current identity, influencing the mythology surrounding him without giving him complete access to the memories themselves. Once we put those two characters beside each other, we get two very different responses to the same problem. How do you live with a past that is part of you, but doesn't completely belong to the person you are now? That is where Finn's past lives become much more complicated than simply discovering that he was Shoko, and that is the connection we need to return to next.
There's a strange detail about Finn's story that becomes much more important once you stop looking at his reincarnations as a collection of interesting Easter eggs. Finn is constantly treated as though he is a young hero discovering himself for the first time. Yet the series gradually reveals that his existence stretches far beyond the life we actually watch. Long before Finn was living in the treehouse with Jake, he had already existed as other people, and some of those lives were connected to events that shaped the history of Ooo. The most obvious example is Shoko, the young thief who lived during Princess Bubblegum's earlier era. But Shoko is only the version of Finn's past life that the audience can see most clearly. The deeper idea is that Finn's identity has never been limited to one lifetime, and Adventure Time uses that idea to quietly change how we understand some of the choices he makes in the present. When Finn meets Shoko's story, there's no dramatic moment where he suddenly remembers everything. He does not wake up and realize that he has been living the wrong life. Instead, the connection is revealed through small details, similarities, and eventually the appearance of Shoko herself. That choice is important because it keeps reincarnation from becoming a simple explanation for Finn's personality. Finn is not Shoko because he remembers being Shoko. He is connected to her because something about her life eventually became part of the larger cycle that produced him. The episode The Vault is especially important because it gives us one of the clearest demonstrations of how this works. Finn is initially confronted by a ghostly figure that seems to have some personal connection to him, but the full story only becomes clear when we discover that the ghost is Shoko. She lived long before Finn, during a period when Princess Bubblegum was still building the Candy Kingdom into the civilization we recognize later. Shoko's life is therefore not some random story from the distant past. It intersects directly with Bubblegum's history, which means Finn's current life is connected to one of the oldest relationships in the modern history of Ooo without Finn himself understanding that connection.
The important part is what happened between Shoko and Bubblegum. Shoko wanted the treasure inside the secret vault, while Bubblegum was trying to protect it. Shoko's actions eventually led to the loss of her arm, and the consequences of that encounter remained attached to the place for centuries. When Finn later enters the same location, he's effectively walking into the consequences of one of his own previous lives. This is where Adventure Time does something unusually clever with reincarnation. The story does not use Shoko simply to tell us that Finn has existed before. It uses Shoko to demonstrate that the past can remain active even after the person who created it. Finn is not consciously carrying Shoko's memories, but the world is carrying the consequences of Shoko's actions. When Finn arrives, he becomes connected to a story that was already waiting for him. That makes the vault itself more significant. It is not simply a haunted location. It is a physical point where several timelines overlap. Shoko's actions created consequences that remained in the world. Bubblegum remembered what happened, and centuries later, Finn becomes the person who finally encounters the unfinished emotional history surrounding it. The strange part is that Finn does not need to remember Shoko for the connection to matter. His relationship with her is already written into the structure of the story. This also explains why Finn's reincarnation is different from a conventional time travel story. If Finn simply traveled backward and met Bubblegum in another era, he would be the same person with the same memories. But reincarnation removes that certainty. Shoko is not walking around waiting to become Finn. She lives an entire life of her own, makes decisions that belong to her, and eventually dies. Much later, another person is born who carries the continuation of that existence without carrying the complete personality of the previous life. That distinction matters because otherwise it would be easy to reduce Finn's past lives to the idea that he is secretly the same character every time. Adventure Time doesn't really support that interpretation. Shoko is Shoko. Finn is Finn. They share a deeper continuity, but their personalities, circumstances, and choices are different. This becomes even clearer when we consider how differently Finn behaves from Shoko. Shoko is driven by survival and resentment, and much of her life is shaped by the world she lives in. She steals because she wants access to something valuable, and she carries anger toward Bubblegum because of what happened between them. Meanwhile, Finn spends much of his life trying to help people, protect his friends, and understand the consequences of his own actions. If reincarnation were simply the transfer of personality, those differences would be difficult to explain. But if reincarnation transfers something deeper than personality, the differences make sense. Finn may inherit a pattern without inheriting the exact behavior. He may inherit a connection without inheriting a memory. He may inherit a life without inheriting the same choices. This is one of the reasons his past lives fit so well with the larger mythology of Adventure Time. The show repeatedly asks whether identity comes from memory, personality, body, soul, relationships, or some combination of all of them. Simon becomes the Ice King when his memories and personality are gradually destroyed, and yet some part of Simon remains. Marceline lives for centuries and accumulates identities that belong to different periods of her life. The elementals return through different individuals, carrying their powers into new personalities. Finn's reincarnations provide another answer to the same question. The soul can continue even when the individual life ends. But that doesn't mean the individual life becomes meaningless. In fact, Shoko's story suggests the opposite. Her choices matter precisely because they belong to her. The fact that Finn eventually becomes her reincarnation does not erase the person Shoko was. If anything, it makes her story more important because it becomes part of a much larger cycle. And this cycle appears to be much older than Finn himself. The episode The Comet gives us a much larger view of Finn's relationship with reincarnation. When the Catalyst Comet arrives, Finn encounters a being that suggests that his existence is part of a recurring cycle connected to cosmic events. The comet is not simply a space object passing through the sky. It's associated with transformation and the possibility of taking on a completely different existence. Finn is given the opportunity to leave his current identity behind, but he ultimately chooses to remain Finn. That decision is crucial because it tells us something about how Adventure Time treats reincarnation. The fact that Finn has existed before does not make his current life predetermined. He still has agency. He still has the ability to choose who he wants to be. This is probably one of the most important things about the entire reincarnation system. If Finn were simply destined to repeat the same life over and over, then his choices would have less meaning. But the series repeatedly shows him encountering circumstances that are similar to those of his previous lives and responding differently. His current life is not simply another repetition, it is another opportunity. That idea also explains why the connections between Finn and his past lives are often subtle. The show does not need Finn to remember everything, because the point is not to give him a complete biography of every person he has ever been. The point is to show that a person can carry something forward without consciously knowing what it is. There are moments throughout Finn's life where his behavior seems to connect with patterns that existed long before him, but the series rarely tells us that he is being controlled by his previous identities. Instead, the past acts more like an invisible background. It provides possibilities, themes, and echoes. And one of the most interesting echoes is his relationship with Bubblegum. Finn's connection to Bubblegum already contains an enormous amount of history because Bubblegum herself has existed for a very long time. But Shoko's story means Finn's relationship with Bubblegum is even older in a strange sense. One version of Finn's soul encountered Bubblegum centuries before the Finn we know was born. That previous relationship ended badly, while the current Finn spends years trying to understand his own feelings toward her. The circumstances are different, but the connection is still there. This is exactly the kind of repetition Adventure Time likes. It does not repeat events perfectly. It repeats emotional structures and then changes the outcome. That is why the idea of past lives becomes more interesting than a simple reincarnation reveal. The show seems to be asking whether people can encounter the same kinds of problems across different lives and eventually respond differently. Shoko and Finn both encounter Bubblegum, but they do not become the same person because of it. Their relationships are shaped by different circumstances. Finn has the opportunity to learn from experiences that Shoko never had, even though he does not consciously remember her life. This also makes Finn's past lives relevant to the theme of responsibility. If Finn is connected to people who lived before him, does he inherit responsibility for what they did? The series seems to answer no, but it gives him something else instead, the opportunity to encounter the consequences. Finn does not cause Shoko's actions, but he encounters the aftermath. He does not choose her mistakes, but he has to deal with what remains. That is a much more subtle form of inheritance than simply inheriting guilt. And it becomes even more interesting when we remember that Finn's world is full of ancient consequences. The Mushroom War created the world he lives in. The elementals shaped civilizations long before him. Evergreen's actions eventually contributed to Simon's transformation. The Lich's existence is connected to cosmic events that existed before modern Wu. Finn is constantly living inside a history he did not create. His reincarnation simply makes that invisible history personal. Instead of being connected to the past because he lives in the same world, he is connected because he has literally been there before. That makes Finn almost uniquely positioned to experience the passage of time in Adventure Time. He is young in the present, but his soul has already passed through multiple eras. He has been human in different circumstances, lived different lives, made different mistakes, and eventually returned to another version of the same world. Yet he still experiences the present as though it is new. That is what makes his choice in the comet so meaningful. When Finn chooses to remain himself, he is not rejecting his previous lives. He is accepting them without allowing them to replace his current identity. He recognizes that whatever came before him, the life he is living now still matters. And that may be the healthiest response to reincarnation that the series could give him. Finn does not need to become Shoko again. He does not need to recover every memory. He does not need to prove that his current life is somehow more important than his previous ones. He simply has to live it. This is also why the past life mythology becomes especially powerful when placed beside the nightosphere. Marceline remembers her past directly. She has centuries of memories and can tell people about things she personally experienced. Finn's relationship to the past is almost the opposite. His history exists, but most of it is inaccessible to him. Marceline can remember Simon as the person he was. Finn cannot remember being Shoko. Marceline can describe the world before the Mushroom War. Finn can only learn about it through other people and artifacts. They both carry enormous histories, but they carry them in completely different ways. Marceline's problem is remembering too much. Finn's problem is not knowing enough. And yet both characters are shaped by the same underlying reality. The past never completely disappears. This is why the reincarnation theme becomes increasingly important as the series moves toward its later episodes. Once we understand that Finn's soul has existed through multiple lives, we can no longer treat his story as an isolated adventure. His choices are part of a cycle that extends beyond the beginning and ending of the series. The series finale reinforces this idea in a particularly quiet way. By the time we reach the end of Finn's main story, we understand that Adventure Time is not really interested in giving us a definitive endpoint for the world. Ooh continues, new generations appear, new heroes emerge, the world changes again. That makes Finn's reincarnation less like a plot twist and more like a structural principle. The story was never designed to belong to one Finn forever. There will always be another version of the cycle. And that is where Shermie becomes important, because Shermie and Beth appear in a future Ooh that is so far removed from Finn's era that almost everything about the original world has changed. Yet Shermie still occupies a role that feels strangely familiar. He is an adventurous figure who asks questions and gets involved in mysteries, while Beth possesses her own connection to Jake's legacy. They are not simply copies of Finn and Jake, but their existence suggests that the world continues producing new versions of the same basic relationship between curiosity, adventure, and companionship. The future, therefore, does not need Finn to continue being Adventure Time. It only needs someone else to carry the story forward. And that brings us back to the most important distinction between reincarnation and simple legacy. If Finn were merely Finn's descendant, the connection would be biological. If he were Finn reincarnated, the connection would be spiritual. But Adventure Time deliberately leaves enough ambiguity that the most interesting possibility sits somewhere between those ideas. The future does not necessarily need to repeat the exact identity of its heroes. It only needs to inherit something from them. That is exactly what happens with Finn's past lives. The details change, the world changes, the person changes, but something continues. And when we put all of this together, Finn's reincarnation becomes much larger than the story of Shoko. Shoko is simply the first clear doorway into a system that reaches across the entire mythology of the series. It connects personal identity to cosmic cycles, ancient history to modern characters, and individual choices to events that happened centuries before anyone in the present was born. Finn is not important because he has lived before. He is important because every time he lives, he gets to make different choices. That is what prevents the cycle from becoming meaningless repetition. The past can return, but it does not have to control the future. And once you understand that, one final question starts becoming impossible to ignore. If Finn can continue through different lives, if the elementals can return through different people, if Marceline can carry the memory of civilizations that no longer exist, and if Betty can transform herself into something completely beyond her original identity, then what exactly remains constant in the world of Adventure Time? That question takes us back to the 4 stories we have been following, because the answer is not one specific character, kingdom, or object. It's the strange ability of Ooh to keep carrying its history forward even when almost everything familiar has disappeared. By this point, the four stories we have been following might seem like they belong to completely different parts of Adventure Time. Finn's past lives are about reincarnation. The elementals are connected to an ancient civilization. Betty's story takes us into the cosmic mythology surrounding Golb, and Marceline's connection to the Nightosphere is rooted in family and supernatural inheritance. But when you place these stories beside each other, something much more interesting starts to appear. Adventure Time keeps returning to the same problem from different directions. People disappear, civilizations collapse, memories become unreliable, powers change hands, an entire world can be transformed, yet something from the past continues to affect whoever comes afterward. The important question is not simply what survived, it is what changed while surviving. Finn is probably the clearest example because his past lives show that continuity does not require the same personality to remain intact. Shoko lived her own life, made her own decisions, and eventually disappeared, but the cycle continued through Finn. The fact that Finn does not remember most of that life is actually important because it prevents reincarnation from becoming a simple continuation of the same character. He is not carrying Shoko around in his head. Instead, he carries a deeper connection that only becomes visible when the present happens to intersect with the past. That means the world can preserve something about a person without preserving everything that made that person unique. The elementals work in a similar way, although their continuity is connected to forces rather than individual souls. The ancient elementals lived in a world where their powers were part of an older civilization, and Patient St. Pim gives us a glimpse of what that world looked like before it became ancient history. But when those elemental forces appear again in modern Ooh, they do not recreate the old civilization. Princess Bubblegum is not simply an ancient candy elemental repeating the same life. Flame Princess is not an old fire civilization returning exactly as it was. The power remains recognizable, but the person using it has changed. And because the person has changed, the meaning of that power changes as well. That distinction is easy to overlook because Adventure Time often uses visual and thematic repetition. Similar colors return, similar abilities return, similar personalities appear, and familiar relationships seem to echo across different eras. But the show almost never tells us that these repetitions are exact. Instead, it allows the audience to recognize the pattern while watching the individual character break away from it. The repetition gives the story a sense of destiny, while the differences preserve the character's freedom. Finn could have remained trapped by the history of his previous lives, but he chooses his own path. Marceline could have accepted the identity that came with being Hunson Abadir's daughter, but she creates a life that looks almost nothing like the world her father rules. The modern elementals could simply reproduce the ancient elemental hierarchy, but they become individuals with completely different relationships to their powers. Betty could have continued searching for a normal solution to Simon's condition, but her determination eventually takes her somewhere beyond anything she originally intended. The pattern becomes clearer the further we move away from the original assumptions of the series. At first, Adventure Time appears to be a story about a boy and his magical dog exploring a strange fantasy world. Later, the world becomes post-apocalyptic. Then it becomes ancient. Then cosmic. Eventually, the audience realizes that Ooh is only one layer in a much larger system of history and transformation. The characters we thought were central are themselves temporary parts of something that existed before them and will continue after them. That is why the Mushroom War is so important, even when it is not directly being discussed. The modern world of Ooh exists because something enormous happens before the main story began. Finn is born into the consequences of an event he never experienced. Marceline survives its aftermath. Princess Bubblegum builds a new civilization on top of what remains. The elementals belong to an even older period, and Simon's story connects that ancient history to the modern world through the Ice Crown. Even Gold belongs to a scale of existence where human history becomes only one small part of a much larger cosmic process. The characters, therefore, do not live at the beginning of the story, they live in the middle of it. This changes the way we should understand the word ancient in Adventure Time. When Finn sees a ruin, it is ancient to him, but the people who built it did not think of themselves as ancient. They were simply living in their present. The same thing happens with the elementals. Patience St. Pim's civilization was not a mysterious legend while she was living in it. It was ordinary life. The people who built those structures did not know that thousands of years later someone would walk through their remains and wonder what happened to them. This is one of the reasons Patience is such an important character for this story. She demonstrates what it means to survive long enough to watch your own world become history. When everyone around you has forgotten the context of your memories, the memories themselves begin to feel almost unreal. Patience can tell modern Ooh about the elementals, but she cannot recreate the world that gave those elementals their original meaning. She has preserved knowledge, but she has not preserved the world that knowledge belonged to. Marceline experiences something similar, although on a much more personal level. She remembers Simon before the Ice King. She remembers the period after the Mushroom War. She remembers people and places that no longer exist. When she tells someone about those things, she's effectively describing a different version of the world. Finn can hear her stories, but he can never experience that world in the same way because he was born centuries later. This creates one of the most interesting differences between Finn and Marceline. Finn is connected to the past through something he cannot fully remember, while Marceline is connected to the past through memories she cannot escape. One character is missing memories, the other has too many. And yet, both eventually have to live in the present. That may be one of the quiet lessons underneath the entire mythology of Adventure Time. Knowing where you came from does not necessarily tell you where you should go, and forgetting where you came from does not necessarily free you from its consequences. Finn does not remember being Shoko, but he still encounters the results of Shoko's decisions. Marceline remembers the old world, but she cannot return to it. Patience remembers the elemental civilization, but she cannot restore it. Betty remembers Simon as he was, but eventually she has to accept that saving him will transform her own existence. In every case, the past remains important without becoming recoverable. That is a very different idea from the usual fantasy story, where the hero discovers an ancient secret and uses it to restore the lost world. Adventure Time almost never does that. Its ancient secrets tend to reveal why restoration is impossible. The more we learn about the past, the more obvious it becomes that the present cannot simply be reversed. Simon cannot become the same person he was before the crown, as though the intervening centuries never happened. Marceline cannot return to the world she knew as a child. The ancient elemental civilization cannot simply reappear because Patience remembers it. Shoko cannot return to life as Shoko simply because Finn is her reincarnation. Betty cannot save Simon without becoming something fundamentally different herself. The past can influence the present, but it cannot be perfectly reconstructed. That is what makes the world feel so old. Not because Adventure Time gives us endless dates and historical explanations, but because almost every important character is carrying some form of incomplete history. There are gaps everywhere. There are things nobody remembers. There are ruins whose original purpose has been forgotten. There are characters who remember events that everyone else considers mythology. There are powers whose origins are older than the civilizations currently using them.
Even the Nightosphere contributes to this feeling because it shows that Oo's history is not limited to the human world, Marceline's family connects the post-apocalyptic Earth to a supernatural realm that existed according to its own rules. The existence of Hunson and the Nightosphere means that the history of U has always been larger than the history of its kingdoms. And once we understand that, the relationship between the different topics in this video becomes much stronger. Finn's reincarnation tells us that history can survive inside an individual. The elementals show that history can survive through recurring forces. Betty's story shows that history can become so overwhelming that someone is willing to sacrifice their own identity to change its consequences. Marceline shows what happens when history survives through memory, family, and supernatural inheritance. 4 different forms of survival. 4 different ways the past can remain present, but none of them are perfect. That is what prevents Adventure Time's mythology from becoming predictable. If every ancient force simply returned unchanged, the world would feel like it was trapped in a loop. If every reincarnated character remembered everything, there would be no mystery surrounding identity. If every lost civilization could be restored, the destruction of U would have no lasting meaning. Instead, the series gives us partial continuity. Something returns, but something else is missing. Finn returns, but Shoko's memories are gone. The elemental forces return, but the ancient civilization is gone. Simon returns, but Betty is gone. Marceline survives, but the world of her childhood is gone. This is why loss is so important to the mythology. Survival in Adventure Time is rarely complete. A character can survive while losing something that cannot be recovered. A civilization can survive through its descendants, while disappearing as a culture. A power can survive while its original meaning is forgotten. A memory can survive while the person who created it no longer exists. That makes the title of our larger story much more appropriate than it might initially seem. The hidden history of U is not hidden because someone deliberately buried every secret. It is hidden because time itself has buried most of it. Every generation inherits fragments. Every character sees only part of the world. Even the audience receives information in pieces, often years after the event actually happened. This is especially obvious with the elementals. When we first meet characters like Princess Bubblegum or Flame Princess, we have no reason to think that their abilities are connected to a much older elemental system. The connection becomes visible only after the series gives us more historical information. Once we know about Patience and Evergreen, earlier details become more meaningful. The same thing happens with Finn. When the series begins, he is simply Finn. The idea that he has lived before is not part of his everyday identity. Only later does the audience discover Shoko, the Catalyst Comet, and the larger reincarnation cycle. The reveal does not completely rewrite Finn. Instead, it adds another layer underneath what was already there. That is one of Adventure Time's strongest storytelling techniques, revelation through recontextualization. A later piece of information makes an earlier scene mean something different without requiring the original scene to have been changed. When we see Simon and Marceline together after knowing their full history, their relationship feels different. When we see Bubblegum after learning about her connection to the ancient elementals, her obsession with control feels different. When we see Finn after learning about Shoko, his identity feels different. When we see Betty's desperation after understanding how long she spent trying to restore Simon, her final decision feels different. The story becomes deeper not because the old scenes were incomplete, but because our understanding of them was. And that is exactly what good lore should do. It should not simply add information. It should change the way the information we already know feels. This is why the Nightosphere also deserves to be viewed differently after everything else we have covered. At first, it can look like an isolated supernatural realm introduced mainly to create a conflict involving Marceline and Hunson. But once we understand the broader mythology, it becomes another example of U's layered history. Marceline's father comes from a world that existed outside the human civilization destroyed by the Mushroom War, yet Marceline herself becomes part of the new world that develops afterward. She is proof that the old world and new world did not simply replace one another, they mixed. The same is true of the elementals. The same is true of Finn. The same is true of Betty. U is not a clean succession of eras where one world ends and another begins. The eras overlap. That is why ancient characters can still affect modern events. That is why artifacts can carry consequences across thousands of years. That is why reincarnation can bring an old soul into a completely different historical environment. And that is why Marceline can remember a world that everyone else knows only through ruins. Once you look at Adventure Time this way, even the concept of an ending becomes more complicated. A story can end without its world ending. Finn's main adventure can end, but Finn's soul does not necessarily disappear from the larger cycle. The ancient elementals can disappear as a civilization, but their powers continue. Betty's story can end, but her transformation becomes part of the cosmic mythology. Marceline's childhood can end, but the memories remain part of who she becomes. The show itself can end, but U continues. That last point is especially important because Adventure Time's ending deliberately refuses to make the world feel finished. There are still characters alive. There are still kingdoms. There are still mysteries. There are still generations that have not been shown. The world continues outside the boundaries of the story we watched. And that means the audience is left in the same position as the characters when they encounter ancient ruins. We know that something existed before us. We know that something will exist after us, but we only get to see one small section in between. That is what gives U its strange sense of depth. The world feels bigger than the story because the story is not presented as the entire history of the world. It is one chapter inside a much larger cycle. And this is where Finn's past lives become especially important again. If Finn can be reincarnated after his life ends, then the end of one Adventure Time story does not necessarily represent the end of the character's existence. It represents the end of one version of his story. Somewhere beyond that ending, another life may begin under completely different circumstances. The same principle applies to U itself. A civilization can collapse. Another can rise, another can disappear, another can emerge from its ruins. The people change, but the world continues accumulating history. That is why the final part of the story needs to look at the one thing that connects all four topics, the possibility that Adventure Time's greatest recurring theme is not survival, but transformation. The characters survive by becoming different. The world survives by becoming different. The powers survive by finding new people to carry them. Memories survive by changing the people who remember them. And once that becomes clear, the strange events we have been following stop looking like unrelated pieces of lore and start looking like different examples of the same enormous process that has been operating across U for thousands of years.
There is a point in Adventure Time where the world becomes so old that trying to find its true beginning almost stops making sense. We can follow the history backward from Finn to Shoko, from Shoko to Princess Bubblegum's earlier life, from Bubblegum to the ancient elementals, from the elementals to Evergreen and the events surrounding the Mushroom War, and from there into a cosmic history that existed before any of the kingdoms we recognize were ever built. At the same time, we can follow the opposite direction and watch those old forces gradually appear again in new forms. Finn becomes another life in an enormous cycle. Elemental powers return through new people. Marceline carries the memory of a civilization that no longer exists. Betty's love for Simon eventually takes her somewhere beyond anything she could have imagined when her story began. The more history we uncover, the harder it becomes to point at one moment and say, this is where Adventure Time truly started, because U was already changing long before Finn ever picked up a sword. That is probably the most important thing to understand about the mythology of the series. Adventure Time does not treat history as a straight line in which one era completely replaces another. Instead, history behaves more like layers. The oldest things remain underneath the newest things, sometimes buried, sometimes forgotten, and sometimes suddenly becoming relevant again after hundreds or thousands of years. A person can walk through a modern kingdom and unknowingly stand on top of something ancient. A magical object can look harmless until its history is revealed. A person can appear completely ordinary until we discover that their soul has already lived several lives. Even the supernatural creatures of Wu can carry pieces of a world that existed long before the characters we know. Finn's past lives are the clearest example because they turn this idea of historical layers into something personal. Shoko was not simply an earlier version of Finn waiting for the correct moment to return. She was a real person who had her own motivations, her own mistakes, and her own relationship with the world around her. When her life ended, those experiences did not simply disappear. They became part of the larger cycle that eventually produced Finn. Yet Finn was not required to repeat Shoko's life. He did not inherit her anger toward Bubblegum. He did not inherit every memory of her childhood. He did not have to become the person she was. Instead, he received the possibility of another life and another set of choices. That distinction is what makes reincarnation in Adventure Time so much more interesting than simple immortality. Immortality would allow the same person to continue indefinitely, carrying the same memories and personality forward. Reincarnation allows the person to change completely while something deeper continues. The result is a world where identity can survive without remaining identical. Finn can be connected to Shoko without being Shoko. That means the cycle is not simply repeating itself, it is changing every time it returns. This also explains why Finn's decision to remain himself when confronted with the possibility of another transformation matters so much. He does not need to know exactly who he was before in order to understand that the life he has now is worth choosing. His previous lives do not make his current identity less real. If anything, they make the decision to live as Finn more meaningful because he is choosing one version of himself from an enormous collection of possibilities. And that same principle can be applied to the elementals. The ancient elementals were powerful enough to shape entire civilizations, but the world they belonged to eventually disappeared. Patient Saint Pim survives, and through her we get a glimpse of a time when these forces were not historical curiosities, but living parts of civilization. Yet when elemental powers emerge again in modern Wu, they do not restore the old world, they become part of a new one. Candy, fire, ice, slime, and the other elemental forces continue to exist, but their modern hosts have different personalities, different relationships, and different problems. This is important because it shows that the world does not preserve things by keeping them unchanged. It preserves them by allowing them to adapt. Princess Bubblegum is not the same candy elemental that existed in the distant past, even though the connection is there. Flame Princess is not simply repeating the life of an ancient fire elemental. Ice-related powers do not automatically recreate the exact circumstances that produced Evergreen. The force survives, but the context changes. That is why ancient history in Adventure Time so often feels strangely familiar and completely alien at the same time. We recognize the patterns, but the details are different. The same forces keep appearing, but the people carrying them have their own identities. The same emotional conflicts return, but the characters sometimes find different solutions. This is also why Evergreen's story matters far beyond the creation of the Ice Crown. Evergreen believes he is acting to save the world, but his attempt to control the situation ultimately produces consequences that reach far beyond his own lifetime. The crown survives, its power survives, its curse survives. Eventually, it reaches Simon, and through Simon, it changes the history of Wu again. Simon's transformation then affects Marceline, and Marceline's memories preserve Simon even after the original man is almost completely gone. One decision therefore creates a chain that continues across thousands of years. Evergreen could never have predicted it all. That is one of the most important ideas in the series. People rarely understand the full consequences of what they do because they cannot see the future generations that will inherit their choices. Marceline experiences this from the opposite direction. She is one of the people who has to live with consequences created before she was born. The Mushroom War destroys the civilization her mother belonged to. Marceline survives the aftermath and grows up in a world that is already fundamentally different from the one her parents knew. She then carries those memories forward into the modern era, becoming a living connection between two versions of Earth. Her relationship with Simon makes that connection even more powerful. Simon is not simply someone Marceline knew when she was young. He is one of the few surviving pieces of the world that existed before the Ice King completely replaced him. When Marceline remembers Simon, she is remembering a person that most of modern Wu never knew existed. And yet, Simon's story continues to matter. It matters to Marceline. It matters to Betty. It matters to the Ice King. It matters to the mythology of the Ice Crown. It matters to the history of the Mushroom War. It matters to the emotional core of the series. This is how Adventure Time turns individual stories into history. A character does not need to become a famous king or conquer a continent to leave an impact. Sometimes a single relationship is enough. A memory can survive for centuries and eventually affect people who were never alive when the original events happened. That is exactly what happens with Betty. At first, Betty's goal seems relatively simple. She wants to save Simon. She wants to restore the man she knew before the Ice King took over his life. But the longer she pursues that goal, the more complicated it becomes. She starts by searching for magical solutions and eventually becomes willing to sacrifice increasingly large parts of her own life. Her story demonstrates another form of inheritance, the inheritance of an unresolved problem. Simon loses himself because of the crown. Betty refuses to accept that loss. Her refusal then becomes its own force, shaping her life until the desire to restore Simon eventually overwhelms almost everything else. When she finally encounters Golb, the scale of the story changes completely. Betty is no longer simply trying to reverse a curse. She is confronting a cosmic force that exists on a level far beyond the ordinary concerns of Wu. Yet, even here, the central motivation remains personal. She still wants to protect Simon. That is what makes her story so tragic. The cosmic mythology does not erase the emotional reason she started. It amplifies it. Betty's story also demonstrates that survival is not always the same as restoration. She succeeds in protecting Simon, but she cannot simply return him to the exact person he was when she first met him. The world has changed. Simon has changed. Betty has changed. The relationship cannot simply be restored to its original form because too much time has passed. Instead, Betty becomes part of something entirely different. Her sacrifice does not produce a perfect return to the past. It creates a new reality. That is exactly the same pattern we saw with Finn and the Elementals. Something from the past survives, but it returns in a changed form. This may be the closest thing Adventure Time has to a rule governing its entire universe. Nothing truly disappears without leaving something behind, but nothing survives completely unchanged either. Finn's soul continues, but each life is different. The elemental forces continue, but each generation changes them. Simon survives, but his identity is transformed by the crown. Betty survives in a form that is completely different from the person she was. Marceline survives while almost everyone and everything from her childhood disappears. Even the Night Sphere continues, but Marceline chooses not to make it the center of her existence. And this is why the Night Sphere belongs in the same conversation. Hunson represents an inheritance Marceline could have accepted without question. She could have allowed her bloodline to determine her future. Instead, she creates an identity outside of it. Her relationship with her father remains part of her story, but it does not dictate the person she becomes. That is another way Adventure Time approaches the idea of cycles. The cycle does not necessarily have to be broken by destroying the past. Sometimes it is broken simply by responding differently. Shoko makes certain choices. Finn encounters similar emotional territory and makes different choices. Evergreen creates the Ice Crown because he believes control is necessary. Simon uses the crown and gradually loses control of himself. Betty responds to Simon's transformation by becoming increasingly determined to preserve him. Eventually, she gives up almost everything in an attempt to preserve him. The pattern keeps changing as it moves from one person to another. That is why the world of Ooh never feels completely deterministic. There are patterns, but there are also choices. And this is perhaps the most important thing we can take from Finn's reincarnation. If every life were simply predetermined by the previous one, there would be no reason for the characters to grow. The fact that Finn can become different people across different lives means that the cycle itself has room for change. The soul may continue, but the circumstances are never the exact same. That idea becomes even more powerful when we think about the future of Ooh. The series gives us glimpses of a world long after Finn and Jake's main adventures. Shermie and Beth exist in a future where many of the things we recognize have changed or disappeared. The kingdoms have evolved. New civilizations have developed. Old objects have become artifacts. The world looks both familiar and unfamiliar. But there are still adventurers. There are still mysteries. There are still people discovering the remains of the past. And there are still characters who seem to occupy roles that remind us of Finn and Jake. This is not necessarily proof that Finn and Jake literally reincarnated into Shermie and Beth, and the show deliberately leaves room for interpretation. What matters is that the pattern continues. The world produces another story, just like Finn and Jake once did. Their story belongs to a new era, but the basic structure of adventure remains. That is exactly how the cycle works. The characters do not have to return exactly as they were. The world only needs to produce another story. And that makes the ending of Adventure Time feel very different from the ending of a conventional fantasy series. Usually, when the main characters defeat the final threat, the world reaches a state of completion. The kingdom is saved, the villain is defeated, and the heroes can finally rest because the major conflict has been resolved. Adventure Time does something quieter. The story ends. The world does not. There are still problems. There are still ruins. There are still ancient powers. There are still people who have no idea what happened thousands of years earlier. There are still mysteries waiting for someone to uncover them. In that sense, the ending does not close Ooh. It simply stops following one particular group of people through it. And perhaps that is why the series can feel so much larger than its own runtime. We're never given the complete history, because there is no complete history available from any one perspective. Finn only knows what Finn knows. Marceline remembers what Marceline remembers. Bubblegum has her own version of the past. Patience remembers another. Betty experiences events that almost nobody else can understand. Each character carries a fragment. The audience has to assemble those fragments. And even then, there are gaps. Those gaps are part of what makes Ooh feel real. A world that has existed for thousands of years should have forgotten things. It should have contradictory legends. It should have ruins whose purpose is unknown. It should have stories that survive without anyone knowing whether they are completely accurate. It should have people who remember events differently. Adventure Time understands this surprisingly well. Its history feels ancient because it is incomplete. That is also why the 4 subjects we explored tonight fit together better than they initially seemed to. Finn's past lives show us that identity can continue beyond one lifetime. The elementals show us that ancient forces can return in new forms. Betty's story shows us how one person's attempt to preserve the past can transform the future instead. The Night Sphere shows us that inheritance can shape someone without determining who they become. Each story is asking a slightly different version of the same question. What do you do with what you inherit? Finn inherits a soul with a history he cannot fully remember. The elementals inherit powers older than their own civilization. Betty inherits Bellini's unresolved transformation and makes it the center of her life. Marceline inherits the bloodline of a demon lord, but chooses her own identity. None of them can erase what came before. None of them can completely return to the world that existed before them. So, they move forward with what remains. That may be the quiet philosophy underneath almost every major piece of Adventure Time lore. The past matters, but it is not sacred. The future matters, but it is not predetermined. The world changes constantly, and the characters have to change with it. That is why 1,000 years can pass and Ooo can still feel like Ooo. The surface changes, the people change, the kingdoms change, the technology changes, the magic changes. But the need to explore, to connect with someone, to understand where you came from, and to decide what kind of person you want to become remains. And maybe that is why Finn's story does not really need a permanent ending. If his soul continues, another life can eventually begin. If the elementals continue, another generation can carry their forces. If old memories survive, someone will eventually discover them. If new civilizations rise, someone will eventually walk through their ruins. The world does not need the original heroes to remain exactly the same forever. It only needs someone to keep looking. That is what Shermie and Beth represent more than anything else. Whether they are connected to Finn and Jake through reincarnation, ancestry, symbolism, or simply the repeating structure of adventure, they show that the world has not stopped. A new generation has inherited a strange, ancient Ooo, and they're beginning to uncover it in the same way Finn once uncovered the mysteries that existed before him. Which means that, in a strange way, the viewer is placed in the same position. We spend the series thinking we are watching Finn discover Ooo, but eventually we realize that Finn was also discovering a world that existed long before him. He was walking through someone else's history. And now, when we look at the future of Ooo, someone else will eventually be walking through his. The treehouse can become a ruin. A sword can become an artifact. A story can become a legend. A person can become a reincarnation. A civilization can become a forgotten lair beneath another civilization. And yet the meaning doesn't completely disappear. It changes hands. It changes shape. It becomes something that another person can discover much later and wonder about in exactly the same way we have wondered about the people before Finn. That is probably the most fitting way to understand Adventure Time's enormous timeline. It is not really a story about a world that survives forever in the same form. It is a story about a world that keeps becoming something else. Finn was not the first hero of Ooo. He will not be the last. Marceline was not the first person to survive the collapse of a world, and she will not be the last person to carry its memories. The elementals were not the first ancient forces to return, and they will not be the last ones. Betty was not the first person to sacrifice herself for someone she loved, and her transformation will not be the final strange event in Oo's history. There is always another era waiting beyond the one we can see. And perhaps that is why, after everything we have uncovered, the most interesting question is no longer what happened thousands of years ago. It is what will happen thousands of years from now. Because somewhere in that distant future, someone else may discover the remains of Finn's world. They may find an old object they don't understand, hear a story about a human hero who once traveled with a magical dog, or walk into a place where someone long forgotten once made a decision that changed the course of history. They may not know exactly who Finn was. They may not understand what Marceline remembered. They may have no idea why an ancient elemental symbol is carved in a wall. but they will be standing inside the consequences of those lives. And that is where Adventure Time leaves us. Not at the end of Ooh, but somewhere in the middle of its history. A world disappears. Another one grows over it. And eventually, that world becomes history too. Someone remembers. Someone forgets. Someone is born carrying an old soul. Someone inherits an ancient power. Someone finds a ruin and wonders who built it. Then, without realizing it, they become another layer for the people who come after them to discover. So when you look back at Finn, at Shoko, at Evergreen, at Betty, at Marceline, and at the Night Sphere, and all those fragments of history scattered throughout Ooh, they stop feeling like separate mysteries. They become pieces of the same enormous idea, that nothing in this world stays exactly where it started, but very little disappears completely. Something always remains, and eventually, someone finds it.